Chapter 1. The Lonely Programmer. His name was Mark Elliott Zuckerberg, and loneliness was something he understood intimately, even if he would never have described it that way. He grew up in Dobbs Ferry, New York, a leafy suburb about 20 miles north of Manhattan, the kind of place where successful families raised ambitious children. His father was a dentist who ran his practice from the ground floor of their home. His mother was a psychiatrist who'd stepped back from her practice to raise 4 children. Mark was the second child, the only son, sandwiched between sisters in a household that valued achievement and education above almost everything else. By all accounts, he was a prodigy, not the warm, charismatic kind that adults fawn over at dinner parties, but the quiet, obsessive kind that makes parents both proud and slightly worried. While other kids played soccer or learned piano with reluctant discipline, Mark taught himself to code. He was 11 years old when he built his first program. Chapter 1. The Lonely Programmer. His name was Mark Elliott Zuckerberg, and loneliness was something he understood intimately, even if he would never have described it that way. He grew up in Dobbs Ferry, New York, a leafy suburb about 20 miles north of Manhattan, the kind of place where successful families raised ambitious children. His father was a dentist who ran his practice from the ground floor of their home. His mother was a psychiatrist who'd stepped back from her practice to raise 4 children. Mark was the second child, the only son, sandwiched between sisters in a household that valued achievement and education above almost everything else. By all accounts, he was a prodigy, not the warm, charismatic kind that adults fawn over at dinner parties, but the quiet, obsessive kind that makes parents both proud and slightly worried. While other kids played soccer or learned piano with reluctant discipline, Mark taught himself to code. He was 11 years old when he built his first program, a messaging system that connected the computers in his father's dental office so the receptionist could alert his dad when a patient arrived without having to shout down the hallway. He called it ZuckNet. Even then, even at 11, the impulse was the same. Use technology to connect people across distance, to solve with code what felt impossible in person. School was complicated for him. He was intellectually bored and socially awkward, a combination that rarely leads to popularity. At Ardsley High School, he took graduate-level courses at nearby Mercy College because his school had nothing left to teach him. He captained the fencing team, which makes a certain kind of sense. A sport that's individual, technical, strategic. A sport where you can be good without being particularly warm. His classmates remember him as intense, focused, the kind of person who, when he decided to learn something, would disappear into it completely. Ancient Greek, psychology, computer science. He absorbed information the way other teenagers absorbed music or sports statistics. He read the Aeneid in Latin for fun. He built a music player called Synapse that used artificial intelligence to learn your listening habits. This was 1999, years before Spotify, years before algorithms were something normal people thought about. Companies tried to buy Synapse. Microsoft and AOL both made offers. He was still in high school. He turned them down, not because he didn't want money or success, but because he wanted to finish what he'd started. He wanted to go to college. He wanted, in his own particular way, to have a normal life. Harvard accepted him in 2002. Of course it did. Perfect SAT scores, a prodigy programmer, captain of the fencing team. On paper, he was exactly what elite universities were looking for. But Harvard wasn't what he was looking for. Not really. He didn't go there to join final clubs or network with the sons of senators. He went there because it was the obvious next step, and because even brilliant, awkward teenagers don't always know what they actually want. He lived in Kirkland House, then moved to Currier House. He studied computer science and psychology, a combination that, in retrospect, seems almost prophetic. How do minds work? How do people work? How can you predict behavior, influence it, change it? His dorm room became his laboratory. While his classmates were at parties or studying for exams, Mark was coding. Always coding. He built Course Match, a program that lets students see what classes their friends were taking, because he'd noticed that people chose courses based on who else would be there. Social connection as a practical tool. He built FaceMash, which was less innocent. Late one night in October 2003, after a girl had apparently rejected him, accounts differ on exactly what happened, he hacked into Harvard's student databases and downloaded photos from the dormitory Facebooks. He built a website where you could compare two students' photos side by side and vote on who was more attractive. Hot or not, but with real classmates, real faces, real judgments. The site crashed Harvard's network in a matter of hours. 450 people had voted 22,000 times. It was a disaster, and it was a revelation. Mark was hauled before the Harvard administration. He was almost expelled. He apologized, sort of, but what he'd learned was more important than any punishment. People were hungry for this, desperate for it. A way to judge, to compare, to see and be seen. He'd touched something primal, something that had nothing to do with good coding and everything to do with human nature. The administration shut down FaceMash. They called it invasion of privacy. They called it misogyny. They weren't wrong. But Mark was already thinking about what came next, because he'd discovered something that night that would shape everything that followed. He'd discovered that people would come, that if you gave them a way to see each other, to evaluate each other, to connect and compare and compete, they would show up in numbers that would crash your servers. That the desire to be seen was stronger than privacy, stronger than dignity, stronger than almost anything. He was 19 years old. He was lonely. He was brilliant. And he'd just figured out how to turn loneliness into architecture. Chapter 2. The Night Everything Changed. January 2004 was bitter cold in Cambridge. The kind of cold that makes your breath visible in thick clouds, that turns the Charles River into a sheet of gray ice. Students shuffled between classes with their heads down, scarves wrapped tight, thinking about spring break and warm beds and anything except where they were. Mark was in his dorm room. Again. Always. His roommate, Dustin Moskovitz, was there too, probably studying or sleeping or trying to ignore the relentless sound of Mark's fingers on the keyboard. They'd met through random housing assignment, the kind of algorithmic luck that colleges use to pair strangers, and they'd become friends in the way that shared space and shared interests can forge friendship, even when personalities don't quite match. Mark had been thinking about FaceMash, not the scandal of it. He'd moved past that with the kind of selective memory that successful people develop. But the lesson of it? The numbers, the engagement, the way people had flocked to the site, even though, or maybe because, it was cruel. But he was also thinking about something else, something bigger. He'd been approached by 3 upperclassmen, Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss, identical twins who rode crew, and their friend Divya Narendra. They wanted to hire Mark to finish a project they'd been working on called Harvard Connection, later renamed Connect U. It would be a social network for Harvard students, a way to make friends and connections in a structured, exclusive environment. Mark had said yes, or said something like yes. He'd agreed to work on it, taken their ideas, attended a few meetings. But he wasn't really working on it. He was stalling, because he'd realized something. Their idea was good, but their execution was wrong. They were thinking too small, too exclusive, too focused on dating and status. And more importantly, if he built it for them, it would be theirs. So instead, on a night in mid-January, fueled by whatever combination of ambition and insomnia and loneliness that drives 19-year-olds to change the world, Mark started building his own version. He called it the Facebook, stylized as one word, but with a capital F in the middle. which looked strange and memorable and exactly right. The concept was simple: a digital version of the printed Facebooks that universities gave to freshmen to help them learn their classmates' names. But this one would be online, searchable, social. You could add friends, write on their walls, see who they knew, build a network, connection by connection, like nodes in a graph that expanded outward infinitely. He worked for 6 days straight, barely sleeping, barely eating. The kind of manic focus that from the outside looks like madness, but from the inside feels like absolute clarity. Dustin helped, though it was mostly Mark's vision, Mark's code, Mark's obsessive drive to get it finished and perfect and launched. On February 4th, 2004, at around 6 in the evening, Mark sent an email to a few friends with the subject line, "Check out the facebook.com." The site was live. You needed a Harvard email address to register. You created a profile with your name, your dorm, your interests. You could search for people, add them as friends, and browse their networks. It was clean and simple, and exactly what students had been waiting for, without knowing they were waiting for it. Within 24 hours, 1,200 Harvard students had signed up. Within a month, more than half the undergraduate population was on it. The growth was organic, viral, unstoppable. Students would finish class and immediately check the Facebook to see who'd added them, who'd written on their wall, who was friends with whom. It was gossip and connection and surveillance, all wrapped into one compulsively refreshable page. Mark was stunned. And then he wasn't, because this was what FaceMash had taught him. People wanted this, needed it even. The chance to curate yourself, to see others, to exist in a space where social dynamics were visible and navigable and under your control. But there were immediate problems. The Winklevoss twins found out. They were furious. They'd hired Mark to build their site, and instead he'd built his own competing version, using, they claimed, their ideas. They sent him cease and desist letters. They threatened lawsuits. They told anyone who would listen that Mark Zuckerberg was a thief who'd stolen their idea and their code. Mark's response was dismissive. In instant messages that would later become public, devastatingly public, he was contemptuous. He called them dumb fucks for trusting him with their idea. He bragged that he had access to thousands of students' private information because they trust me. He added, "Dumb fucks." The messages are hard to read now, knowing everything that came after. They reveal someone young and arrogant and careless with other people's trust. They reveal someone who saw users as data points, connections as assets, privacy as something people were willing to trade for convenience. But they also reveal something else. They reveal someone who understood, at a bone-deep level, that he'd created something powerful, that the site was growing faster than he'd imagined, that he was onto something bigger than a college directory or a dating site or anything the Winklevoss twins had envisioned. Within weeks, the Facebook expanded to other schools: Stanford, Columbia, Yale. Mark and Dustin would stay up all night adding new universities, tweaking the code, watching the numbers climb. They brought in Eduardo Saverin, a friend from their economics class, to handle the business side. They brought in Chris Hughes to manage communications and design. They were exhausted and exhilarated and completely out of their depth. By March, the site had 30,000 users. By the end of the spring semester, it was over 100,000. Students at schools that didn't have access yet were emailing constantly, begging to be added. The demand was insatiable. Mark made a decision. He wasn't going back to Harvard in the fall. Or maybe he was. He wasn't sure. But first, he was going to California. Silicon Valley. Palo Alto. The place where Stanford students built companies instead of just studying. The place where you could turn code into capital, where venture capitalists would give money to teenagers with good ideas and no experience. Eduardo thought they should stay in Boston, build slowly, keep it as a college thing. But Mark saw bigger. He always saw bigger. That was both his gift and his curse. The inability to be satisfied with what was, when he could see what might be. So in June 2004, Mark and Dustin packed up their laptops and flew west. They rented a house on La Jennifer Way in Palo Alto, a modest suburban place with a pool and too many bedrooms. They brought in a few other friends to help with coding. They set up an office in the living room. They painted a mural on the wall with a graffiti-style image of a young person and the words, "Move fast and break things." That phrase would become their unofficial motto, move fast and break things. It meant be aggressive. It meant don't wait for permission. It meant growth mattered more than perfection. Speed mattered more than safety. It meant that if you broke something, a feature, a friendship, a promise, someone's privacy, you could always fix it later. But you had to move fast first. What Mark didn't know that summer was that he wouldn't be going back to Harvard, that he'd never finish his degree, at least not then, that the site he'd built in 6 days would consume the next 20 years of his life, that the blue logo he'd chosen almost at random would become one of the most recognizable symbols on Earth. He didn't know that the Facebook would become Facebook, and Facebook would become Meta, and that he would become one of the richest and most controversial and most misunderstood people of his generation. He didn't know that the thing he'd built to solve loneliness would make millions of people feel more lonely than ever. All he knew that summer was that the numbers kept climbing, and climbing, and climbing. And that was enough. Chapter 3, The Expansion. The house on La Jennifer Way smelled like stale pizza and energy drinks, and the particular kind of sweat that comes from 20-year-olds who've forgotten that showers are supposed to happen daily. There were laptops everywhere, on the kitchen counter, on the couch, balanced on the edge of the pool table they never used for pool. The walls were covered with whiteboards, filled with diagrams and user metrics and feature ideas scrawled in different colored markers. This was the summer of 2004, and this was how empires began. Not in boardrooms or corner offices, but in rented houses with bad furniture and worse hygiene, with young men who believed so completely in what they were building that everything else, sleep, food, relationships, conventional paths, became negotiable. Mark was different in California. Not warmer exactly, but more focused, more certain. In Boston, he'd been a student who happened to build websites. In Palo Alto, he was a founder. The distinction mattered. Silicon Valley didn't care that he was a college dropout, or that he wore the same gray t-shirt 3 days in a row, or that he was awkward in meetings. Silicon Valley cared about growth, about users, about whether you were building something that would scale. And the Facebook was scaling in ways that made even experienced investors pause and recalibrate their assumptions about what was possible. By the end of that summer, the site had reached 200,000 users. They were adding entire universities every few days. Michigan, Penn, Princeton. Schools would go live, and within hours their servers would strain under the load as thousands of students rushed to create profiles, add friends, browse through their classmates' photos and interests and relationship statuses. Because that was the genius of it, the thing that separated the Facebook from every social network that had come before. It wasn't anonymous. It wasn't random strangers connecting over shared interests. It was real people using real names, creating digital versions of their actual social lives. It was a mirror, and people couldn't stop looking into it. Mark hired more engineers. Most of them were young, barely out of college themselves, drawn to Palo Alto by the promise of equity and the thrill of building something that was growing faster than anything they'd seen. They worked 18-hour days. They slept under their desks. They competed to see who could write the most elegant code, who could solve the trickiest problems, who could ship new features fastest. The culture Mark created was intense and unforgiving, and completely deliberate. He believed in meritocracy, or at least his version of it. The best ideas won. The fastest coders got respect. If you couldn't keep up, if you needed work-life balance or reassurance or clear direction, you probably didn't belong there. This wasn't a job. It was a mission. Move fast and break things. The motto was everywhere now, on t-shirts and email signatures, painted on the office walls when they finally moved out of the house and into actual office space on University Avenue. It meant something specific in those early days. It meant they were at war with slowness, with bureaucracy, with the old way of building companies where you planned for months before launching anything. But it also meant something else, something Mark maybe didn't fully articulate, even to himself. It meant that the thing they were breaking, the old social contracts about privacy, about identity, about the separation between public and the private life, didn't matter as much as the thing they were building. Sean Parker showed up that summer. He was 24, which made him almost ancient compared to the rest of them, and he'd already built and lost one company, Napster, the music sharing service that had revolutionized and nearly destroyed the recording industry. Sean was charming, in a way Mark wasn't. Charismatic, connected. He knew everyone in Silicon Valley, knew how to pitch, knew how to think not just about product, but about story. Mark was suspicious of him at first. Sean was too smooth, too practiced. But Sean understood something crucial. He understood that the Facebook wasn't just a website. It was a platform, a new kind of social infrastructure. And if they played it right, if they moved fast enough and made the right decisions, it could become the social infrastructure. The place where everyone, not just college students, lived their digital lives. Sean convinced Mark to drop the just Facebook. Cleaner, more confident, more permanent. He helped negotiate their first major investment, $500,000 from Peter Thiel, the PayPal co-founder who was becoming Silicon Valley's most influential early-stage investor. The money meant they could hire more engineers, buy more servers, expand faster. But more importantly, the investment meant validation. Peter Thiel didn't bet on small ideas. He bet on companies that could become monopolies, that could dominate their categories so completely that competition became irrelevant. His investment was a signal to everyone else in the valley. Facebook was real. They expanded beyond colleges. High schools were next, though they had to be careful about this. High school students meant minors, which meant parental concern and media scrutiny, and the possibility of becoming associated with all the things that terrified parents about the internet. They required parental permission for students under 18. They created more restrictive privacy settings. They moved carefully, which was unusual for them. Then, in September 2006, they made the decision that would change everything. They opened Facebook to anyone over 13 with a valid email address. No college affiliation required. No institution verifying your identity. Just you, your email, and whatever version of yourself you wanted to present to the world. The reaction was immediate and split. College students were furious. They'd liked the exclusivity, the sense that Facebook was theirs, a digital space separate from parents and employers and the broader world. Opening it to everyone felt like a betrayal, like their private club had suddenly become a public square. Mark didn't care, or rather, he cared about the numbers more than he cared about the complaints. Within weeks, the user base exploded. Within months, they had 10 million users, then 20 million, then 50 million. People who'd never heard of Facebook suddenly couldn't imagine life without it. Because something fundamental had shifted in how humans related to technology. For decades, the internet had been a place you visited. You'd sit down at a desktop computer, dial up a modem, browse some websites, then log off and return to real life. But Facebook made the internet portable, persistent, always on. You didn't visit Facebook, You lived there. You checked it first thing in the morning, during lunch breaks, before bed. You uploaded photos from vacations and birthday parties. You announced relationships and breakups and job changes. You argued about politics and shared news articles and reconnected with people you'd lost touch with decades ago. Facebook became the place where life happened, or at least where the documented, curated, shareable version of life happened. Mark turned 22, then 23. He was running a company with hundreds of employees and hundreds of millions of users, and he still looked like a college student who'd wandered into the wrong building. He wore hoodies and flip-flops to meetings with investors. He was direct to the point of rudeness. He didn't make small talk or pretend to care about things he didn't care about. But he cared about Facebook with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He would stay in the office until 3 in the morning reviewing code, tweaking algorithms, planning features. He saw patterns that other people missed. He understood, in some instinctive way, how small changes in the interface could produce massive changes in behavior. The news feed launched in September 2006, and it was nearly a disaster. Before Newsfeed, you had to actively visit someone's profile to see what they'd updated. Newsfeed aggregated everything, every status change, every photo upload, every new friendship, into a constantly updating stream on your homepage. It made Facebook dramatically more addictive and dramatically more invasive. Users revolted. Privacy groups protested. People created groups on Facebook itself, demanding that Facebook remove the feature. It felt like surveillance, like every small action was being broadcast to everyone you knew. Mark had broken something, and this time people weren't sure he could fix it. He almost pulled it, almost admitted defeat, but then something interesting happened. People kept using it. They said they hated it, but their behavior told a different story. Time on site went up. Engagement went up. The very people who joined protest groups were spending more time on Facebook than ever before, scrolling through their news feed, checking what their friends were doing, posting updates because they knew people would see them. Mark learned something crucial in that moment. He learned that what people said they wanted and what they actually wanted were often different things. That privacy concerns were abstract, but curiosity was concrete. That if you gave people a way to watch other people's lives unfold in real time, they would watch, even if they said they didn't want to. Especially if they said they didn't want to. By 2007, Facebook was valued at $15 billion. Mark was 23 years old and one of the youngest billionaires in history. Magazines put his face on their covers. Bloggers analyzed his every move. He was simultaneously celebrated as a genius and condemned as a threat to privacy, to relationships, to the very fabric of how humans connected. He married Priscilla Chan, his college girlfriend, the person who'd known him before Facebook's, before the money and fame and scrutiny. They'd met at a party. He was in line for the bathroom, she was leaving, and somehow they'd built something real amid all the unreality. She was studying to be a doctor, which meant she cared about things that had nothing to do with engagement metrics or viral growth. She grounded him, or tried to. But Facebook kept growing, kept spreading, kept reshaping. How billions of people understood connection, identity, truth. It wasn't just a website anymore. It was infrastructure. It was where you found old friends and made new ones, where you learned about weddings and funerals, where you got your news and formed your opinions and decided what mattered. Mark had built something that connected people. That was still true. But he'd also built something else, something he maybe hadn't intended and definitely hadn't anticipated. He'd built a mirror that showed people not just themselves, but an infinite reflection of everyone else's selves. And once you started looking into that mirror, once you saw yourself reflected back through the eyes of hundreds of friends and acquaintances and strangers, it became almost impossible to look away. The world was watching, and the world, for better and worse, was connected. Chapter 4. The Betrayal. There's a scene that plays out over and over in Silicon Valley, so common it's almost mythological. Two founders start a company together. They're friends, partners, bound by shared vision and late nights, and the conviction that they're building something important. Then money arrives, or fame, or just success. And suddenly the friendship becomes a business relationship, and the business relationship becomes a legal dispute. And what started as brotherhood ends in depositions and settlements, and people who can't be in the same room together. For Mark, this story had several versions, and they all hurt, even if he would never admit it. Eduardo Savarine was the first betrayal, or the first person who felt betrayed, depending on whose story you believed. They'd been friends at Harvard, or as close to friends as Mark got. Eduardo was the business guy, the one who understood cap tables and incorporation papers, and how to talk to investors without alienating them. He'd put up the initial money to get Facebook started, about $15,000, which doesn't sound like much now, but was significant when you're 19 and the company is 6 people in a dorm room. Eduardo's name was on the incorporation papers. He was listed as co-founder and CFO. He owned about 30% of the company. On paper, he was Mark's partner. But Eduardo had stayed in New York after that first summer in Palo Alto. He was doing an internship, finishing his degree, living the life of a normal Harvard student, while Mark and the others were in California, building the company at a pace that made normal life impossible. Distance became distance. Eduardo would fly out for meetings, but he wasn't there for the daily decisions, the late-night coding sessions, the moment-by-moment building that creates shared understanding and shared ownership. Sean Parker didn't help. Sean saw Eduardo as a liability, someone who didn't understand the valley, didn't think big enough, wasn't moving fast enough. Sean whispered in Mark's ear about restructuring, about bringing in real business talent, about making sure the equity distribution matched actual contribution. The restructuring happened in stages, quietly, through mechanisms Eduardo didn't fully understand until it was too late. New funding rounds diluted his shares. New stock was issued. His percentage dropped from 30% to less than 10%, and by the time he realized what was happening, his ownership had been reduced to nearly nothing. Eduardo was devastated. Then he was furious. He felt betrayed by Mark, by Sean, by the company he'd helped create. He sued. The lawsuit was vicious and public, and exactly the kind of thing that early-stage companies fear, because it reveals all the messy human drama behind the myth of the brilliant founder. The details came out in depositions. The instant messages where Mark called people dumb fucks. The calculations about who deserved how much equity. The cold business logic that said Eduardo's early contribution didn't justify his ownership stake once the company had grown beyond him. Mark settled. The terms were confidential, but Eduardo got his shares back, or enough of them that he became a billionaire when Facebook went public years later. His name was restored to the list of co-founders on the company's website, but the friendship was over. They didn't speak, didn't appear in photos together, became strangers who happened to have once started a company in a dorm room. Then there were the Winklevoss twins, Cameron and Tyler, identical in appearance and nearly identical in their resentment of Mark Zuckerberg. They'd never stopped believing that Mark had stolen their idea, that Facebook was really their creation, that they'd trusted him, and he'd betrayed that trust in the most calculated way possible. Their lawsuit dragged on for years. They claimed that Mark had agreed to build Harvard Connection, had strung them along while secretly building Facebook, had used their ideas and connections to launch a competing product. Mark's defense was simple. Ideas are cheap, execution is everything, and nothing about Facebook's actual code or features came from their project. The case went to mediation, then to court, then to appeals. The twins were relentless. They rejected a settlement offer of $65 million, convinced they deserved more, that Facebook's value was soaring, and they were entitled to a larger piece. They eventually accepted the settlement, then later tried to void it, claiming they'd been misled about Facebook's true value. The legal system eventually exhausted itself. The twins got their money, they used it to invest in Bitcoin, and became cryptocurrency billionaires, which is its own kind of Silicon Valley karma. But they never got what they really wanted, which was acknowledgement, the belief that history would record them as the real founders and Mark as the thief. Instead, history recorded exactly the opposite. When Aaron Sorkin wrote The Social Network, the acclaimed film about Facebook's founding, Mark was the protagonist. Complicated, yes. Flawed, absolutely. But the protagonist. The twins were supporting characters, privileged jocks who'd had an idea but lacked the vision and skill to execute it. Remember, Mark hated the movie. He said it got almost everything wrong, that it turned real people into archetypes, that it implied his motivation for building Facebook was romantic rejection, when really it was about connection and identity and building something that could scale. He was particularly frustrated that the movie portrayed him as someone who wanted to get into final clubs when he'd never cared about that kind of status. But he also never sued, never demanded corrections. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that you can't control your own story once it becomes public. That narrative has its own momentum, that sometimes the myth becomes more powerful than the truth, and fighting it only gives it energy. The betrayals weren't just legal, they were personal. Chris Hughes, one of the original roommates in that Palo Alto house, eventually left Facebook to work on Barack Obama's presidential campaign. He'd never been a coder. He was the communications guy, the one who made Facebook feel human and accessible. But his departure felt like a rejection. He went on to criticize Facebook publicly, writing op-eds about breaking up the company, about Mark's unchecked power, about how the thing they'd built had become something dangerous. Dustin Moskovitz, Mark's actual roommate from Harvard, the one who'd been there from the beginning, left in 2008. He started his own company, Asana. They remained on good terms, more or less, but Dustin's departure meant that Mark was increasingly surrounded by people he'd hired, rather than people who'd been with him when it was just an idea in a dorm room. Even Sean Parker, the charming mentor who'd helped Mark navigate Silicon Valley, eventually became a liability. Sean got arrested for cocaine possession. He became associated with the kind of excess and recklessness that made investors nervous. Mark had to distance himself, had to make clear that Sean was no longer speaking for the company. It was business. It was necessary. It was also another relationship that calcified into professional courtesy and nothing more. What Mark learned through all of this was that building a company meant making decisions that hurt people. That growth required ruthlessness. That you couldn't keep everyone happy, couldn't preserve every friendship, couldn't let sentiment override strategy. He learned that being a founder meant being lonely at the top, that the people around you were employees or investors or partners, but rarely friends. That trust was something you extended carefully, if at all, because every person close to you was also a potential lawsuit, a potential liability, a potential story that could damage what you were building. The betrayals changed him, made him harder, more careful, more willing to surround himself with lawyers and NDAs and people whose loyalty was contractual rather than personal. He still believed in connection, still believed that Facebook was making the world more open and connected, but he was learning, slowly and painfully, that connection and trust weren't the same thing. That you could connect billions of people and still feel utterly alone. That loneliness wasn't something technology could solve. It was something technology could hide, could defer, could make bearable through the constant distraction of notifications and messages and the reassuring proof that somewhere someone was watching. He was 25 years old. He was worth billions. He'd created something used by hundreds of millions of people, and he'd left behind a trail of broken friendships, legal settlements, and people who would never forgive him for choosing the company over them. The question wasn't whether it was worth it. Mark didn't think in those terms. The question was whether he could live with the cost, whether he could keep moving forward when the past kept pulling him back through lawsuits and movies and interviews where people asked him to explain, to apologize, to admit that maybe he'd done something wrong. He couldn't change the past. He could barely control the present, but he could build the future. That was the only thing that had ever made sense to him. The code, the product, the relentless forward momentum of making something bigger, better, more connected. Even if it meant leaving people behind, even if it meant becoming the kind of person who could do that without looking back. Even if it meant betraying the lonely programmer he'd once been, the one who'd built Facebook because he wanted to bring people together, not drive them apart. Chapter 5. The Valley. Silicon Valley isn't really a valley, not in the way most people imagine valleys. There are no towering mountains on either side, no dramatic vistas. It's a flat sprawl of suburban office parks and beige buildings and palm trees that look transplanted and vaguely out of place. Highway 101 runs through it like an artery, carrying people between San Francisco and San Jose, past billboards advertising cloud computing and enterprise software and things that sound vaguely technological without meaning anything specific. But the geography doesn't matter. Silicon Valley is an idea, a culture, a set of beliefs about how the world works and who deserves to shape it. Mark arrived there as a 19-year-old college dropout with a website and a vision. He left. Not physically. He never really left. But he left behind his old self, and it became something else entirely. Something the Valley recognized and rewarded and reshaped in its own image. The Valley has rules, though no one writes them down. Rule 1. Youth is wisdom. Experience is suspect. If you're over 40 and you haven't already built something significant, you probably never will. The future belongs to people who've never known a world without the internet, who think in networks and platforms, who see disruption as virtue rather than violence. Mark embodied this perfectly. His age wasn't a liability. It was proof of his relevance. He understood what college students wanted because he was barely past being one himself. He moved with the speed and confidence of someone who hadn't lived long enough to accumulate doubt. Rule 2. Scale is everything. A small business that serves its community, that makes modest profits and employs a dozen people, is worth less than a startup losing millions of dollars but growing exponentially. Because scale means potential. Scale means you could be the next Google or Amazon or platform that reorganizes an entire sector of human activity. Profitability can wait. Growth cannot. Facebook was hemorrhaging money in those early years. Servers were expensive. Engineers were expensive. Growth was expensive. But no one cared because the numbers were staggering. Every metric that mattered, users, engagement, time on site, was trending vertical. Mark raised money from Axel Partners, from Greylock, from firms that specialized in finding young founders and giving them enough capital to either succeed spectacularly or fail completely. He learned how to pitch, not in the polished, practiced way that professional CEOs pitch, but in his own particular style. He would show up to meetings in a hoodie and sandals, would project user growth charts without preamble or small talk, would answer questions with the kind of directness that could feel like rudeness, but also like clarity. He didn't try to be likable. He tried to be undeniable. The investors liked this, or enough of them did. They were tired of smooth-talking MBAs with PowerPoints full of market research. They wanted founders who lived and breathed their products, who could quote daily active users from memory, who seemed almost possessed by their vision. Rule 3. Disruption is holy. The Valley worships creative destruction, the Schumpeterian idea that progress requires demolishing old systems to build new ones. It doesn't matter if those old systems employed people, created community, served important functions. If they can be made more efficient through technology, they should be. The displaced workers will find new jobs. The destroyed communities will form new ones. This is progress. This is inevitable. Facebook disrupted newspapers by becoming where people got their news. It disrupted communication by replacing phone calls and letters with status updates and messages. It disrupted identity by making your online persona as important as your offline one, maybe more important. And the Valley celebrated this. Another industry transformed, another market captured, another proof that software was eating the world. Mark absorbed these values so completely that it became hard to tell where he ended and the Valley culture began. He talked about making the world more open and connected, which sounded altruistic, but he also talked about dominating the social networking space, about making Facebook so essential that competition became impossible. These ideas weren't contradictory to him. Dominance was how you achieved the mission. Monopoly was how you ensured that your vision of connection prevailed. He studied other founders obsessively. Steve Jobs, who'd been ousted from Apple, then returned to save it, who understood that products needed to be not just functional but beautiful, totems people wanted to carry and display. Bill Gates, who'd turned Microsoft into an empire through the aggressive tactics and strategic ruthlessness. Larry Page and Sergey Brin, who'd built Google on the belief that organizing the world's information was a technical problem with a technical solution. But Mark was also different from them. Jobs was a showman, theatrical and charismatic. Gates was a strategist, methodical and precise. Page and Brin were academics who'd stumbled into business. Mark was none of these things. He was socially awkward but strategically brilliant. He didn't care about charisma or showmanship. He cared about the product, about the network effects, about building something that would still matter decades after he was gone. The Valley gave him mentors. Mark Andreessen, the Netscape founder who'd become a powerful investor, took Mark under his wing. They would have dinner regularly, Mark sharing lessons from the browser wars, from the dot-com boom and bust, from decades of watching companies rise and fall. He taught Mark about board management, about when to compromise and when to hold firm, about preserving founder control, even as the company grew. Peter Thiel taught him different lessons. Peter believed in monopolies, in companies that dominated their categories so completely that competition became irrelevant. He believed in contrarian thinking, in doing what everyone else thought was crazy, because that's where the biggest opportunities lay. He believed that great founders were almost messianic, possessed by visions that others couldn't see. Mark listened, absorbed, implemented. He restructured Facebook's stock to give himself majority voting control, which meant that even as he sold shares and brought in new investors, he maintained the power to make unilateral decisions. He could overrule his board, overrule his shareholders, overrule anyone who disagreed with his vision. It was the ultimate Valley power move: grow the company massively while keeping absolute control. The Valley also gave him competition. Twitter launched, and suddenly people were wondering if short-form public updates might be more powerful than Facebook's walled garden of friends and profiles. MySpace was declining, but still had more users. Google tried repeatedly to build social networks, throwing enormous resources at products like Orkut and Google. Plus, that never quite caught on, but reminded Mark that giants could enter his space at any moment. He became paranoid about competition. Not visibly. He still projected confidence, still talked about Facebook's inevitable dominance, but internally, strategically. He instituted regular meetings where teams would analyze potential threats, companies that were growing fast or innovating in ways that could challenge Facebook. He acquired companies not just for their technology, but to eliminate them as competitors before they became dangerous. The Valley loved this too. Aggression disguised as strategy. Elimination disguised as acquisition. It was how the game was played. You didn't just build your company. You destroyed the possibility of competitors building theirs. Mark turned 25, then 26. He was too young to rent a car without extra fees, but old enough to control a company with billions of dollars in revenue and nearly 1 billion users. The Valley didn't find this strange. Youth was proof you understood the future. Experience was proof you were stuck in the past. He adopted the Valley uniform. Gray t-shirts, jeans, the same outfit every day, because Steve Jobs had done it, and because making decisions about clothing was inefficient when you could be making decisions about products. Some people thought this was affectation. It probably was, at least partly, but it was also practical. Everything in Mark's life became optimized for Facebook. His time, his energy, his appearance, his relationships. He moved to a modest house in Palo Alto, modest by billionaire standards anyway. He drove an Acura, then later a Volkswagen. He didn't collect cars or buy yachts, or engage in the conspicuous consumption that often accompanies sudden wealth. This wasn't virtue. It was focus. He wasn't interested in luxury. He was interested in building. The Valley taught him to see himself as special, not in the crude sense of being better than other people, but in the specific sense of being one of the rare individuals capable of building something that billions of people would use. The Valley had a name for this. Founder Mode. It meant operating at an intensity and with a vision that normal executives couldn't match. It meant being willing to make decisions that others would call reckless or insane because you could see something they couldn't. Mark lived in founder mode constantly. He worked 100-hour weeks not because anyone forced him to, but because the company was never finished, never good enough, never growing fast enough. There was always another feature to ship, another market to enter, another competitor to worry about. Rest was inefficiency. Vacation was wasted time. The mission demanded everything, and he gave it everything, and the Valley celebrated him for it. But the Valley also changed him in ways that were harder to see. It made him less interested in being liked and more interested in being right. It made him less willing to admit mistakes and more willing to reframe them as learning experiences or necessary growing pains. It made him see criticism as something that came from people who didn't understand the mission, who were too risk-averse or too conventional to grasp what Facebook was trying to achieve. The Valley has a way of surrounding you with people who agree with you, who tell you that your vision is brilliant, your strategy is sound, your instincts are correct, not because they're sycophants, though some of them are, but because the very fact that you've succeeded at this level is proof that you see something others don't. Disagreeing with you becomes difficult because your track record speaks louder than their concerns. Mark's inner circle shrank. The people close to him were the ones who'd proven their loyalty, who believed in the mission as completely as he did, who were willing to work at the same inhuman pace and make the same sacrifices. Everyone else fell away. Not dramatically, not with conflict, but through the slow erosion that happens when your life becomes your company, and your company becomes your life. Sheryl Sandberg joined as COO in 2008. She was 40, which made her ancient by Valley standards, but she brought something Mark desperately needed: the ability to talk to advertisers, to build a business model, to translate Facebook's massive user base into actual revenue. She was polished where Mark was awkward, diplomatic where he was direct. They complemented each other. She ran the business. He ran the product. It worked. But even this relationship was fundamentally transactional, professional. They respected each other, relied on each other, but they weren't friends in any real sense. They were partners in building something too large for either of them to manage alone. By 2010, Facebook had 500 million users. 500 million. The number was almost incomprehensible. It meant that roughly 1 in 14 humans on Earth had a Facebook account. The Valley had taught Mark to think at scale. But this was scale beyond anything even the Valley's most ambitious dreamers had imagined. And yet, he wasn't satisfied. 500 million wasn't enough. 1 billion wasn't enough. 2 billion wasn't enough, because the mission, making the world more open and connected, had no natural endpoint. You couldn't connect half the world and declare victory. You had to connect all of it. Everyone. Everywhere. Forever. The Valley had given Mark many things. Capital. Mentors. A culture that celebrated his ambition and forgave his awkwardness, and believed that what he was building mattered more than how he built it. But it had also taken something from him. The part that might have questioned whether unlimited growth was wise. The part that might have wondered whether connecting everyone meant surveillance, whether openness meant vulnerability, whether his vision of connection might actually be creating new forms of isolation. The Valley didn't ask these questions. And so, neither did Mark. He'd become what the Valley required. A builder, a disruptor, a founder who would sacrifice everything, privacy, friendships, his own humanity, for the mission. He was no longer the lonely programmer in a dorm room. He was the CEO of one of the most powerful companies on Earth. And the Valley looked at what he'd become and saw exactly what it had always wanted to create. A perfect machine for turning connection into capital, loneliness into engagement, and human relationships into data that could be analyzed, optimized, and monetized at scale. Chapter 6. The Billion User Milestone. There's a number that haunts every social network, Dunbar's number. Robin Dunbar, a British anthropologist, proposed that humans can maintain stable social relationships with roughly 150 people. It's based on the size of the neocortex, on the cognitive load of tracking relationships, on the fact that maintaining friendship requires time and attention and emotional energy, all of which are finite. 150 people, that's a tribe, a village, the number of wedding invitations you might send, or faces you'd recognize at a high school reunion. It's human scale. Manageable. Facebook, by 2012, had 1 billion users. The announcement came in October. Mark posted about it on Facebook, naturally. 1 billion people using the site every month. 1 in 7 humans on Earth. The number was so large, it stopped meaning anything specific. It was just big. Incomprehensibly big. The kind of big that makes you a platform rather than a product. Infrastructure rather than a service. The growth had been relentless. After the 500 million milestone, Mark had looked at the map of the world and seen everywhere Facebook wasn't as an unfinished mission. They expanded aggressively into international markets. India, Brazil, Indonesia, countries where internet access was just beginning to spread, where smartphones were becoming affordable, where hundreds of millions of people were coming online for the first time and choosing Facebook as their primary, sometimes only, window to the digital world. They translated the site into dozens of languages. They built lightweight versions that worked on slow connections and cheap phones. They struck deals with mobile carriers to make Facebook access free, which sounds generous until you realize it meant that for millions of people, Facebook wasn't just part of the internet, it was the internet. Mark talked about connecting the unconnected, about bringing the benefits of the internet to people in developing nations, about how access to information and communication could lift people out of poverty, create opportunities, change lives. And he believed this, at least partly. He saw himself as a missionary for connection, spreading the gospel of openness to places that had been isolated and offline. But the growth also brought problems that no one had anticipated, because no one had ever operated at this scale before. A billion users meant a billion different contexts, cultures, norms. What was acceptable speech in California was hate speech in Myanmar. What was satire in France was blasphemy in Pakistan. What was political discourse in one country was illegal dissent in another. Facebook had become a global platform, but it had been built by a small team of Americans who'd assumed that everyone used the internet the way they did. The content moderation challenges were staggering. Every minute, thousands of pieces of content were being posted. Photos, status updates, comments, shares. Some of it was innocuous. Some of it was beautiful. Some of it was violent, hateful, dangerous. Facebook hired thousands of moderators to review flagged content. People who spent their days looking at the worst things humans do to each other. Beheadings, child abuse, graphic violence, and deciding what violated community standards and what didn't. The moderators were mostly contractors, paid low wages, given inadequate psychological support, burned out within months. They made split-second decisions about content that was often culturally ambiguous, linguistically complex, politically fraught. They were supposed to apply consistent standards to a billion different contexts. It was impossible, but it was necessary. Because if Facebook didn't moderate, it would become a cesspool. And if it over-moderated, it would be accused of censorship. Mark hated this. He'd built Facebook on the premise that connection was inherently good, that giving people tools to share and communicate would make the world better. He believed in free expression, in the marketplace of ideas, in the notion that more speech, not less, was the solution to bad speech. Moderation felt like failure, like admitting that people couldn't be trusted with the tools he'd given them. But the reality was undeniable. A billion users included terrorists recruiting members, scammers stealing identities, bullies tormenting classmates, groups organizing violence. The same features that let families stay connected let bad actors coordinate harm. The openness that Mark celebrated could also enable exploitation. The algorithms became more sophisticated. Facebook needed to decide what content to show people, because showing everything chronologically was overwhelming and inefficient. So they built a system, EdgeRank, later called the newsfeed algorithm, that predicted what you'd want to see based on what you'd engaged with before. It showed you more of what you liked, less of what you ignored. It learned your preferences, your biases, your interests. It was elegant engineering. It made Facebook more addictive, more personally relevant. Time on site increased, engagement increased, revenue increased. But the algorithm also created filter bubbles. If you clicked on liberal news sources, Facebook showed you more liberal content. If you engaged with conservative posts, you got more conservative content. The system optimized for engagement, and engagement was highest when content confirmed what you already believed or outraged you about what others believed. Facebook was no longer just connecting people. It was shaping what they saw, what they believed, what they thought everyone else believed. It had become an invisible editor, curating reality for a billion people based on what would keep them scrolling. Mark didn't see this as a problem, not initially. Personalization was a feature, not a bug. Why shouldn't people see content relevant to their interests? Why should they wade through posts about topics they didn't care about? The algorithm was making Facebook better, more useful, more efficient. The billion-user milestone meant Facebook was worth more than $100 billion. The company went public in May 2012, one of the most anticipated IPOs in history. Mark showed up to the opening bell ceremony at NASDAQ, wearing his standard hoodie. Some investors were furious. This was a formal occasion, they said. Show some respect. But Mark's message was clear. Facebook would do things its way. The hoodie stayed. The IPO was supposed to be a triumph. Instead, it was a technical disaster. NASDAQ's systems couldn't handle the trading volume. Orders were delayed. Prices were wrong. People who'd bought shares didn't know if their purchases had gone through. The stock price, initially set at $38, barely moved on opening day, then dropped steadily in the months that followed. Investors lost billions. Lawsuits were filed. Mark's fortune, at least on paper, shrank dramatically, but he was now operating in public view in a way he never had before. As a private company, Facebook could make decisions based on long-term vision. As a public company, it had quarterly earnings calls, shareholder expectations, analysts questioning every strategic choice. Mark hated it. He'd structured the company's stock to maintain his control precisely so he could ignore shareholders when necessary. But he couldn't ignore the scrutiny. Every product decision, every privacy controversy, every shift in user growth became headline news. Facebook wasn't just a company anymore. It was a proxy for debates about privacy, speech, power, technology's role in society. The billion users weren't just accounts. They were people with expectations, grievances, political agendas. They formed communities around shared interests, some beautiful, some toxic. They used Facebook to organize protests and plan attacks. They shared baby photos and conspiracy theories. They found long-lost friends and radicalized themselves in echo chambers of increasingly extreme content. Mark gave interviews trying to explain Facebook's mission. He talked about the hacker way, the company's unofficial philosophy of constant iteration and bold risk-taking. He talked about making the world more connected, but the reporters kept asking uncomfortable questions. What about privacy? What about fake news? What about the fact that your platform was being used to organize ethnic cleansing in Myanmar? He didn't have good answers. Or rather, he had answers that satisfied him, but not the people asking. He believed that the benefits of connection outweighed the harms, that Facebook was a net positive for the world, that the problems were growing pains, temporary issues that could be solved with better technology, smarter algorithms, more sophisticated AI. But a billion users meant a billion potential problems, and they were multiplying faster than Facebook could solve them. For every content moderator they hired, 10,000 new pieces of problematic content were posted. For every algorithm tweak to reduce misinformation, bad actors found new ways to game the system. For every privacy setting they added, users found new reasons to distrust how their data was being used. The billion-user milestone should have been pure celebration. Facebook had achieved something unprecedented, a scale of human connection that had never existed before. Mark was 32 years old and had built something that touched 1/7 of humanity. But scale cuts both ways. At a billion users, every small problem becomes a massive crisis. Every edge case affects millions of people. Every algorithmic bias compounds into systemic harm. Every mistake made in the early days, the move fast and break things mentality, the prioritization of growth over safety, the assumption that connection was inherently good, became harder to fix because the system had grown so large and complex that changing it risked breaking things that billions of people depended on. Mark stood in Facebook's headquarters, looking at screens showing real-time user activity. A billion people, across every continent, in nearly every country, speaking hundreds of languages, from different cultures and contexts and life experiences. All of them connected through something he'd built in a dorm room when he was 19. He'd wanted to connect people. He'd succeeded beyond anything he'd imagined, and now he was discovering what happens when you achieve exactly what you wanted. The connections were real. The consequences were too. Chapter 7. The Acquisitions. There's a famous photograph from April 2012, Mark Zuckerberg sitting in a conference room with Kevin Systrom, Instagram's young founder, signing papers. Mark is wearing his gray t-shirt. Kevin looks nervous, excited, overwhelmed. They're shaking hands. Everyone is smiling. Facebook had just agreed to buy Instagram for $1 billion. $1 billion for a company that was 13 months old, had 13 employees, and made zero revenue. The tech press called it insane. Analysts questioned Mark's judgment. Some of Facebook's own board members wondered if he'd lost perspective. But Mark knew exactly what he was doing. Instagram wasn't just a photo-sharing app. It was a threat. It was mobile first. In a way, Facebook wasn't. It was cool in a way. Facebook increasingly wasn't. Teenagers were flocking to it because their parents weren't there yet. It was growing fast, 30 million users and accelerating. And Mark understood that companies growing that fast don't stay independent for long. Either they become giants themselves, or they get acquired, or they run out of money and disappear. Mark wasn't going to let Instagram become a giant, and he wasn't going to let Google or Twitter acquire it and turn it into a weapon against Facebook. So he bought it, paid more than anyone thought it was worth, paid so much that it became a news story in itself. The deal closed in September 2012. Mark promised that Instagram would remain independent, would keep its brand and its culture and its team. Kevin would stay on as CEO. Instagram would benefit from Facebook's infrastructure and resources, but it wouldn't be absorbed. It would be allowed to grow in its own direction. This promise lasted for a while. Instagram did remain relatively independent. It kept growing, 100 million users, then 200 million, then 500 million. It became more popular than Twitter. It became where people shared the curated, beautiful version of their lives, while Facebook became where they argued about politics and posted family updates. But independence is always temporary when a larger company owns you. Eventually, Instagram's founders left. They'd grown tired of Mark's oversight, tired of having their decisions questioned and overruled, tired of the slow erosion of autonomy. They left in 2018 without the warm goodbyes and mutual respect statements that usually accompany founder departures. The exit was tense, barely civil, a corporate divorce that everyone pretended was amicable. By then, Mark had already made his second major acquisition, WhatsApp, in 2014. This one was even more staggering, $19 billion. $19 billion for a messaging app that had 55 employees and charged users 99 cents per year. The price was so high, it bordered on absurd. But again, Mark saw what others didn't. WhatsApp had 600 million users and was adding 1 million new users every day. It dominated messaging in Europe, Latin America, India, markets where Facebook Messenger was struggling. More importantly, WhatsApp's founders, Jan Koum and Brian Acton, had built the app on a foundation of privacy and encryption. They promised never to show ads, never to sell user data, never to compromise on security. Mark bought them anyway. He promised that WhatsApp would remain independent, would keep its commitment to privacy, would never be integrated with Facebook's data collection apparatus. Jan and Brian joined Facebook's board. They were uncomfortable with Mark's vision, with Facebook's business model, with the whole apparatus of surveillance capitalism. But they took the money and convinced themselves they could preserve WhatsApp's values from inside Facebook. They couldn't. By 2018, Brian Acton had left, walking away from over $1 billion in unvested stock because he couldn't stomach the direction Facebook was pushing WhatsApp. Jan Koum left shortly after. They'd watched as Facebook pressured WhatsApp to share more data, to integrate more deeply with Facebook's infrastructure, to compromise on the privacy principles that had made WhatsApp special. Mark's response was essentially, growth requires these changes. Integration creates better products. Users benefit from Facebook and WhatsApp working together. The privacy concerns are overblown. There was a third major acquisition, smaller but strategically important. Oculus VR in 2014 for $2 billion. This one confused people. Oculus made virtual reality headsets, clunky devices that made you look ridiculous and mostly appealed to gamers and tech enthusiasts. What did VR have to do with social networking? Mark had a vision. He believed that virtual reality would be the next computing platform after mobile. That eventually, people would do everything in VR: work, play, socialize. That Facebook needed to own the hardware and software for this future, or risk becoming irrelevant when the platform shifted. Palmer Luckey, Oculus's founder, was eccentric and brilliant, and very young. He'd built the first Oculus prototype in his parents' garage using duct tape and circuit boards, and sheer determination. He believed VR could change everything: education, entertainment, human connection itself. But Palmer was also politically controversial. He supported Donald Trump, which in Silicon Valley was close to heresy. He donated money to a pro-Trump organization that created inflammatory memes. When this became public in 2016, Facebook's employees were outraged. Palmer became a liability. Mark pushed him out in 2017, though the official story was that Palmer left voluntarily. The pattern was consistent: buy the company, promise independence, gradually absorb it, push out the founders when they become inconvenient. It wasn't personal. It was strategic. Mark was building an empire, and empires don't tolerate independent fiefdoms within their borders. The acquisitions served multiple purposes. They eliminated competition. Instagram and WhatsApp could have become Facebook killers if left independent. They brought talent, the engineers and designers who'd built these products. They expanded Facebook's reach into new markets and demographics and use cases. But most importantly, they gave Mark control over the future. He couldn't predict exactly how social networking would evolve, which features would matter, which platforms would rise. So he bought optionality. Instagram gave him photo sharing. WhatsApp gave him messaging. Oculus gave him virtual reality. Between them and Facebook's core product, he'd covered most of the ways humans might want to connect digitally. The antitrust concerns started quietly. A few academic papers, some op-eds. People began asking whether it was healthy for one company, one person, to control so much of how humans communicated. Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp together reached over 3 billion people. That was more than a third of humanity. That was more reach than any government, any religion, any institution in human history. Mark's defense was always the same. Users choose Facebook. They're not forced to use it. There's competition. Twitter, Snapchat, TikTok, dozens of other apps. If Facebook wasn't providing value, people would leave. The fact that they don't leave proves that Facebook is doing something right. But this argument ignored something crucial. When a platform reaches a certain scale, it stops being optional. If everyone you know is on Facebook, if your family shares photos there, if your community organizes events there, if local businesses communicate through Facebook pages, then leaving Facebook means cutting yourself off from your own life. The network effect that made Facebook valuable also made it inescapable. Mark had learned this from studying Microsoft's antitrust battles in the 1990s. Microsoft had argued that consumers could choose other operating systems, other browsers. Technically true. Practically impossible. Once Windows was on 90% of computers, once everyone used Word and Excel, switching meant incompatibility, relearning everything, losing access to the ecosystem. Facebook had created the same dynamic, but even stronger, because Microsoft controlled software, but Facebook controlled relationships. You could switch from Windows to Mac and still talk to your friends. If you left Facebook, you lost touch with people. The lock-in wasn't technical, it was social. The acquisitions made this worse. Now, Mark controlled not just Facebook, but the apps people had fled to when Facebook became too crowded with parents and aunts and political arguments. Teenagers left Facebook for Instagram, but Mark owned Instagram. Privacy-conscious users left for WhatsApp, but Mark owned WhatsApp. The exits were illusions, different doors leading to the same house. By 2019, the calls to break up Facebook were growing louder. Elizabeth Warren, running for president, made it a central campaign promise. Chris Hughes, Mark's old roommate and co-founder, wrote a New York Times op-ed titled, "It's Time to Break Up Facebook." Regulators in the US and Europe were investigating. Mark's response was to dig in. He argued that breaking up Facebook would hurt users, would make the products worse, would cede the field to Chinese competitors who weren't constrained by American regulations. He argued that Facebook's scale was necessary to combat problems like terrorism and child exploitation. You needed massive resources to moderate billions of pieces of content. He restructured the company, renaming it Meta and positioning Facebook as just one product among many. But this was largely cosmetic. The power structure remained the same. The control remained the same. Mark Zuckerberg still had majority voting rights. He could still overrule anyone, ignore any criticism, pursue any strategy he believed in. The acquisitions had given him reach and power unprecedented in the history of media, but they'd also made him a target. Every harm caused by Facebook, Instagram, or WhatsApp was now attributed to him personally. Every moderation failure, every privacy breach, every instance of the platforms being used for harm, all of it landed on his shoulders. He'd bought these companies to secure Facebook's future. Instead, he tied their fates together, ensuring that when one failed, they all suffered the consequences. When Facebook faced a reckoning, Instagram and WhatsApp would too. When regulators came after the company, they came after all of it. Mark was 35 years old. He controlled the largest communications network in human history. He'd acquired or destroyed every significant competitor. He'd built a moat so wide that crossing it seemed impossible. But moats work both ways. They keep competitors out. They also keep you in. Mark had surrounded himself with so much power, so much control, so much infrastructure, that changing course became nearly impossible. The acquisitions that had seemed so brilliant, so strategic, so necessary, they'd also become chains. He'd wanted to own the future of human connection. He'd succeeded. And now he was discovering that owning something that large, that important, that consequential, meant bearing responsibility for all of it. Every hate crime organized on Facebook, every election interfered with through Instagram, every piece of misinformation spread through WhatsApp, every teenager whose self-esteem was destroyed by comparing themselves to impossible standards on social media. All of it was his now. All of it bore his name. All of it would be his legacy. He'd bought companies to eliminate threats. Instead, he'd acquired accountability for the entire digital social landscape. The acquisitions that were supposed to protect Facebook had made it impossible for Mark to escape what Facebook had become. A mirror reflecting back everything about human nature, the good and the bad and the ugly, at a scale no one had ever imagined, and no one, not even Mark, knew how to control. Chapter 8, The Reckoning. The year 2016 should have been a triumph. Facebook reached 1.8 billion monthly active users. Revenue topped $27 billion. The stock price climbed steadily. By every metric that Silicon Valley cared about, Facebook was winning. But something had gone terribly wrong. On November 8, 2016, Donald Trump won the U.S. presidential election. The result shocked pollsters, journalists, and half the country. But more than the outcome itself, what shocked people was how it had happened. The campaign had been fought as much on Facebook as on television or in rallies. Misinformation had spread faster than fact-checking. Foreign actors had bought ads targeting specific voters. Fake news articles, completely fabricated stories presented as journalism, had been shared millions of times. And Facebook had let it happen, or hadn't stopped it, or hadn't noticed until too late. The distinction didn't matter much to the people demanding answers. In the days after the election, Mark gave an interview where he dismissed the idea that fake news on Facebook had influenced the outcome. He called it a pretty crazy idea. He seemed genuinely puzzled that anyone would think Facebook bore responsibility for how people used the platform. Facebook was a tool. How people chose to use it wasn't Facebook's fault. This response infuriated people. It sounded callous, disconnected, like Mark couldn't see or wouldn't acknowledge that a tool used by 2 billion people wasn't neutral. That the design choices Facebook made, the algorithms it deployed, the ads it sold, the content it promoted, all of this shaped political reality. Mark walked back his statement within days. He announced new initiatives to combat fake news, but the damage was done. The narrative had shifted. Facebook wasn't just a platform anymore. It was a threat to democracy. Then came the investigations. Multiple congressional committees began looking into Russian interference in the election. They wanted to know what Facebook knew and when they knew it. Had Facebook sold ads to Russian operatives? Had it allowed foreign governments to manipulate American voters? Had it prioritized engagement and revenue over democratic integrity? The answer, it turned out, was yes to all of these questions. Facebook eventually disclosed that Russian-linked accounts had purchased about $100,000 in ads, had created fake activist groups, had organized real-world rallies where Americans showed up not knowing they were being manipulated by foreign intelligence operations. The reach was massive. The content had been seen by over 100 million Americans. Mark appeared before Congress in April 2018. It was his first public testimony, and the preparation was intense. He spent weeks with lawyers and communications experts, anticipating questions, rehearsing answers, learning how to navigate the performative aspects of congressional hearings. He wore a suit, no hoodie this time. He sat at a small table facing senators arranged in a semicircle above him, a physical arrangement designed to emphasize their power and his accountability. For 2 days, senators questioned him about privacy, about data sharing, about Russian interference, about whether Facebook was a monopoly, about why he'd let things get so bad. Some of the questions revealed that the senators didn't understand how Facebook worked, how the internet worked, how any of this technology functioned. There was a famous exchange where Senator Orrin Hatch asked how Facebook made money if it was free. Mark paused, then delivered a line that would become a meme. "Senator, we run ads." But other questions were harder. Senator Dick Durbin asked Mark if he'd be comfortable sharing which hotel he'd stayed at the previous night, or if he'd be willing to read out the names of people he'd messaged recently. Mark said no, he wouldn't be comfortable with that. Durbin's point was devastating in its simplicity. If Mark valued his own privacy, why didn't he protect his users' privacy with the same care? Mark tried to explain Facebook's privacy model. Users controlled their own data. They chose what to share. Facebook just provided the platform. But this explanation rang hollow. When the senators kept pointing to specific failures, the fact that Facebook had given data access to app developers who'd sold it to third parties, the fact that users' friends could expose their data without their consent, the fact that Facebook's privacy settings were so complex that even sophisticated users couldn't fully understand what they were agreeing to. The Cambridge Analytica scandal had broken just weeks before the hearing. A political consulting firm had harvested data from 87 million Facebook users without their consent. They'd used this data to build psychological profiles and target voters with personalized political ads. The data came from a personality quiz app that only about 270,000 people had installed, but Facebook's API had allowed the app to also collect data on all their friends. This was the architecture of surveillance that Facebook had built. Not surveillance by Facebook necessarily, but surveillance enabled by Facebook. The company had created systems that treated user data as liquid, something that could flow freely between apps and developers and third parties, as long as someone somewhere had clicked agree on a terms of service document that no one read. Mark apologized during the hearings. He apologized a lot. He took responsibility, said Facebook had made mistakes, promised to do better. He committed to hiring more content moderators, building better AI systems to detect harmful content, being more transparent about how the platform worked. But apologies only work if people believe you're sorry and capable of change. Many of the senators, and many watching the hearings, weren't convinced of either. The European Union was even tougher. They passed the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which imposed strict requirements on how companies could collect, use, and share personal data. Facebook faced massive fines if it violated the rules. Other countries followed with their own regulations. The era of self-regulation was over. The revelations kept coming. Internal documents leaked by whistleblowers showed that Facebook had known about many of these problems for years, that employees had written memos warning about election interference, about the spread of misinformation, about the radicalization happening in private groups, that Facebook had run studies showing Instagram was harmful to teenage girls' mental health, then buried the findings. Mark tried to control the narrative. He wrote op-eds about his vision for a privacy-focused social platform. He gave interviews explaining Facebook's commitment to fixing problems. He posted about new features, new policies, new investments in safety and security. But each revelation undermined his credibility. The gap between what Mark said publicly and what Facebook did internally kept growing. He talked about privacy, while Facebook collected ever more data. He talked about free expression, while Facebook's algorithms suppressed some voices and amplified others. He talked about bringing people together, while Facebook's own research showed the platform was driving polarization. The personal toll was visible. Mark looked older, more worn down. The congressional hearings had been brutal. The constant media scrutiny was relentless. Every decision Facebook made became a news story. Every policy change was analyzed for hidden motives. Every apology was dismissed as insincere. His fortune was still enormous. He remained one of the richest people on earth. But wealth couldn't protect him from becoming one of the most criticized and distrusted figures in technology. His favorable ratings in polls dropped to levels usually reserved for politicians and used car salesmen. In Myanmar, Facebook was linked to genocide. The military had used Facebook to spread hate speech and organize violence against the Rohingya minority. Over 700,000 Rohingya fled to Bangladesh. Thousands were killed. UN investigators called Facebook a useful instrument for those seeking to spread hate. Mark had promised to make the world more connected, but in Myanmar, that connection had been weaponized for ethnic cleansing. Facebook's defense was that they hadn't had enough Burmese-speaking moderators, hadn't understood the local context, hadn't anticipated how military propaganda would exploit their platform. These explanations were true, but insufficient. Facebook had rushed into Myanmar and other developing countries without adequate preparation because growth mattered more than safety. Move fast and break things. But some things, once broken, couldn't be fixed. Mark gave a speech at Georgetown University in 2019 defending free expression. He argued that Facebook shouldn't be the arbiter of truth, that people should be free to share their opinions, even if those opinions were wrong or offensive, that the solution to bad speech was more speech. It was a principled position, one that aligned with liberal democratic values. But it ignored the reality of how Facebook's algorithms worked. Free expression is one thing when everyone has equal access to an audience. It's different when algorithms amplify some voices over others, when engagement-driven design privileges outrage over nuance, when foreign governments and bad actors have learned to game the system. Facebook wasn't a neutral platform. It was an attention-shaping machine that had become one of the most powerful forces in media and politics, pretending otherwise, insisting that Facebook was just giving people tools, and what they did with those tools wasn't Facebook's responsibility. This position became increasingly untenable as the body count rose. Because there was a body count. People killed in Sri Lanka after false rumors spread on Facebook. Protesters in Ethiopia killed during unrest, organized through Facebook groups. People radicalized in Facebook communities, then committing violence in the real world. It wasn't always direct. It wasn't always Facebook's fault, but it was always on Facebook's platform. Mark was 36 years old. He'd spent half his life building Facebook, and now he was spending his days answering for what it had become. The hearings, the bad press, the whistleblowers, the leaked documents, the calls to break up the company, the regulatory investigations in a dozen countries. He'd wanted to connect people. He'd succeeded. He'd connected people who shared conspiracy theories and radicalized each other. He'd connected advertisers with users whose attention could be bought and sold. He'd connected political operatives with voters whose fears and prejudices could be micro-targeted. He'd connected everyone to everyone else in ways that made truth and lies indistinguishable, made real relationships and performative ones blend together, made being alone feel unbearable and being connected feel exhausting. The reckoning had come, not in the form he'd imagined, not competition or technological obsolescence, but in the slow, grinding accountability that comes when your creation touches billions of lives, and some of those lives are destroyed. Mark could apologize. He could promise to do better. He could hire more moderators and build better AI and implement new policies. But he couldn't undo what had been done, couldn't unconnect the people who'd been connected, couldn't erase the harm that had already occurred. The lonely programmer who'd built Facebook to bring people together had created something that connected everyone, and discovered too late that universal connection without wisdom, without restraint, without understanding the human cost, was just another form of chaos. Profitable chaos, global chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Chapter 9, The Apology Tour. There's a particular kind of public penance that powerful people perform when they've lost the public's trust. They go on television, sit for long interviews, answer tough questions with practiced humility. They write op-eds explaining their values. They visit communities they've harmed. They promise, over and over, that things will be different this time. Mark Zuckerberg did all of this, and none of it worked. The tour began in earnest in 2018, after Cambridge Analytica, after the election interference revelations, after it became clear that Facebook's reputation had shifted from innovative to dangerous. Mark scheduled interviews with major news outlets. He met with lawmakers in multiple countries. He published lengthy posts on Facebook, explaining his thinking, his regrets, his plans for the future. In every interview, the script was similar. The interviewer would confront him with Facebook's failures. Mark would acknowledge the mistakes. He would take responsibility. I'm responsible for what happens on our platform. And then he would pivot to the solutions Facebook was implementing. More content moderators, better AI systems, increased transparency, new privacy tools. So, the problem was that people had heard this before. Mark had been apologizing for Facebook's failures since 2006, when the news feed launched and users revolted. He'd apologized for privacy breaches in 2007, 2009, 2011. He'd apologized for the emotional contagion study in 2014, when Facebook had manipulated users' feeds to see if they could alter their moods. He'd apologized for the ethnic cleansing in Myanmar, for Russian interference, for Cambridge Analytica. For every major scandal, there had been an apology. At some point, repeated apologies become meaningless. They become part of the pattern rather than a break from it. Facebook would cause harm, Mark would apologize, the company would promise to change. Then the next scandal would arrive and the cycle would repeat. Mark seemed genuinely frustrated that people didn't believe him. In his mind, Facebook was trying to fix these problems. They'd increased their safety and security team from 10,000 to 30,000 people. They'd invested billions in content moderation and AI detection systems. They'd implemented new policies limiting political ads. They were trying. But trying wasn't enough when you were operating at the scale of billions of users. When your platform touched that many lives, good intentions didn't absolve you of outcomes. And the outcomes kept being harmful. Part of the problem was structural. Facebook's business model depended on engagement. The more time people spent on the platform, the more ads Facebook could show, the more money it made. This created an inherent conflict between safety and revenue. Content that was engaging was often content that was outrageous, divisive, emotionally manipulative. Conspiracy theories were engaging. Hate speech was engaging. Misinformation was engaging. Facebook's algorithms had learned to promote whatever kept people scrolling, and what kept people scrolling was often the worst of human nature. The AI didn't care about truth or kindness or social cohesion. It cared about clicks, reactions, shares. It optimized for engagement and discovered that anger and fear and tribal identity were the most reliable sources of engagement. Mark would argue that Facebook had changed the algorithms, that they had adjusted the ranking to prioritize meaningful social interactions over viral content. But the fundamental tension remained. Facebook was a public company. It had shareholders demanding growth. It had advertisers expecting results. It couldn't afford to make changes that significantly reduced engagement, even if those changes would make the platform healthier. The apology tour took Mark to unexpected places. He did a listening tour across America, visiting small towns and meeting with people who felt left behind by globalization and technological change. He met with farmers in Ohio, factory workers in Michigan, recovering addicts in Appalachia. The optics were obvious. Billionaire tech CEO trying to understand regular Americans, but Mark seemed genuinely interested in these conversations. He was searching for something, maybe absolution, maybe understanding, maybe just a reminder that there were real people behind the profiles, that Facebook's users weren't just data points, but humans with complicated lives and legitimate concerns. But the tour also revealed how disconnected Mark had become. He traveled with security teams. He stayed in hotels, not people's homes. He dropped into communities for a few hours, asked questions, took notes, then moved on. He was observing human life from the outside. The way an anthropologist studies a foreign culture, he'd become so wealthy, so powerful, so isolated by his own success, that genuine connection, the thing Facebook was supposedly built to enable, had become nearly impossible for him personally. The employee revolts started around this time. Facebook's workforce had always been mission-driven, people who believed they were making the world better. But as the scandals multiplied, employees began to question whether that was true. They staged walkouts protesting Facebook's refusal to fact-check political ads. They circulated petitions demanding the company take stronger action against hate speech and misinformation. Mark's response was to double down on his principles. He gave speeches to employees defending free expression, arguing that Facebook shouldn't be the arbiter of truth, that taking down content was a last resort. Many employees agreed with this in theory, but in practice, it meant that lies could spread unchecked, that politicians could run demonstrably false ads, that Facebook's commitment to free speech was being weaponized by bad actors. Some employees left. Good people, talented people, who'd joined Facebook believing in the mission and left because they couldn't reconcile what the company was doing with their own values. Each departure was a small indictment. Each resignation letter that leaked to the press was another piece of evidence that something was fundamentally broken. Mark tried giving interviews to friendly outlets, places where he could explain his thinking without constant confrontation. He talked about his interest in ancient Rome, in studying how empires rise and fall. He talked about long-term thinking, about building systems that would last for decades or centuries. He was positioning himself not as a tech CEO, but as a kind of philosopher king, someone thinking about civilization-level questions. The comparison to Roman emperors was more apt than he probably intended. He had accumulated power that was essentially monarchical. He controlled the largest communications network in history. He couldn't be fired by his board or overruled by shareholders. He made decisions that affected billions of people, and those people had no vote, no way to hold him accountable except to stop using the platform, which, given Facebook's network effects, wasn't really an option for most. The European regulators were less impressed by his apologies than American audiences. They fined Facebook billions of dollars for privacy violations. They threatened to break up the company. They passed laws requiring much stricter data protection and giving users more control over their information. Mark complained that European regulation was stifling innovation, but he complied because the alternative was being shut out of a market with hundreds of millions of users. China was a different problem. Facebook had been blocked there since 2009, and Mark had spent years trying to get back in. He learned Mandarin. He met with Chinese officials. He gave a speech entirely in Mandarin at Tsinghua University. He was willing to compromise, to meet whatever requirements the Chinese government demanded, because 1 billion Chinese users represented too much growth potential to ignore. But the Chinese government wasn't interested. They had their own social networks, WeChat, Weibo, and they preferred keeping data about Chinese citizens within systems they could fully control. Mark's charm offensive failed. He'd humiliated himself learning Mandarin, had signaled his willingness to cooperate with authoritarian content restrictions, and gotten nothing in return except criticism from human rights groups for even trying. The apology tour reached its nadir in 2021 when Frances Haugen, a former Facebook product manager, came forward as a whistleblower. She'd spent months secretly copying internal documents before leaving the company. She leaked these documents to journalists, who published a series of damning reports called the Facebook Files. The documents showed that Facebook knew Instagram was harmful to teenage girls and had hidden the research. They showed that Facebook had given preferential treatment to high-profile users, exempting them from the rules that applied to everyone else. They showed that Facebook's own researchers had found the platform was being used to promote human trafficking and organ selling in developing countries. They showed over and over that Facebook knew about serious problems and had either failed to fix them or actively chosen not to, because fixing them would hurt engagement. Frances Haugen testified before Congress. Unlike Mark, she was immediately sympathetic. She was young, articulate, and clearly motivated by genuine concern rather than self-interest. She explained technical concepts clearly. She didn't make excuses. She said that Facebook had prioritized profits over safety, that the company's leadership knew they were causing harm and chose growth anyway. Mark's response was defensive. He posted that the documents were being taken out of context, that Frances didn't have the full picture, that Facebook cared deeply about user safety. But the documents spoke for themselves. They were Facebook's own internal research, Facebook's own employees raising alarms that leadership had ignored. The apology tour had failed because Mark was apologizing for symptoms while refusing to address the disease. He would apologize for specific failures, for Cambridge Analytica, for election interference, for not catching hate speech fast enough. But he wouldn't acknowledge that these failures stemmed from Facebook's fundamental design, from the engagement-driven business model, from the algorithmic amplification of divisive content, from the basic architecture of a system built to maximize time on site, regardless of the human cost. You can't apologize your way out of a structural problem. You can't fix something with speeches and promises when the thing that needs fixing is the very foundation of how your company makes money. Mark was 37 years old. He'd spent years apologizing, testifying, explaining, defending. He'd hired tens of thousands of moderators. He'd built AI systems to detect harmful content. He'd implemented new policies. He'd invested billions in safety and security. And none of it was enough because none of it addressed the core problem. Facebook made money by keeping people engaged. It kept people engaged by showing them content that triggered emotional reactions. Emotional reactions were strongest when the content was outrageous, divisive, fear-inducing, or tribally affirming. Therefore, Facebook's algorithms, however unintentionally, promoted exactly the kind of content that was tearing societies apart. Mark could apologize for this, but he couldn't fix it without fundamentally changing Facebook's business model. And changing the business model would mean lower revenue, lower growth, angry shareholders, a declining stock price. It would mean admitting that the entire system he'd built was predicated on something harmful. So the apologies continued. The promises continued. The minor adjustments and policy tweaks continued. But the fundamental problem remained unsolved because solving it would require Mark to admit something he couldn't admit. That connecting everyone hadn't made the world better. That in many ways, it had made things worse. That his greatest achievement was also his greatest failure. The apology tour taught Mark something painful. That there are some things you can't come back from. Some trust, once broken, can't be restored with words. Some harm, once done, can't be undone with good intentions. He'd wanted to be seen as someone who'd connected the world. Instead, he'd become someone who'd had to apologize for what that connection had wrought. And no amount of apologizing could change the fact that billions of people used Facebook every day, not because they loved it, but because they were trapped in it, dependent on it, unable to imagine their social lives existing anywhere else. The loneliness he'd tried to solve had metastasized into something worse. Not the absence of connection, but the presence of connection without meaning. Not isolation, but the exhausting performance of constant visibility. Not being unseen, but being seen in ways that reduced you to data, to engagement metrics, to a target for ads and manipulation. Mark had apologized for the specific harms, but he'd never apologized for the fundamental bargain at the heart of Facebook. We'll connect you to everyone, but the price is that everyone can see you, everyone can judge you, everyone can use you, and we'll profit from all of it. That bargain was the thing that needed apologizing for, and that was the one apology Mark would never give. Chapter 10. The Pivot. Picture a man standing at the edge of what he's built, looking out over territory he controls but no longer enjoys. He's won every battle. He's defeated every competitor. He's accumulated wealth and power beyond measure. And he's profoundly, deeply unhappy. This was Mark in 2021. Facebook had nearly 3 billion users. Instagram had over 1 billion. WhatsApp had 2 billion. The company's market cap exceeded $900 billion. By every external measure, he'd succeeded beyond what any of his early supporters had imagined. But the ground beneath him had shifted. Regulators were circling. Antitrust investigations were accelerating in the US, Europe, and elsewhere. Employees were demoralized. Users increasingly viewed Facebook with suspicion or resentment, staying on the platform out of habit rather than affection. His personal reputation was in tatters. Polls showed he was one of the least trusted public figures in America. More troubling for Mark personally was that Facebook was no longer cool. It had become where your parents shared memes and argued about politics. Young people, the users who determined what platforms would dominate the future, were abandoning Facebook for TikTok, Snapchat, newer apps that hadn't yet been colonized by older generations. Mark saw the pattern. He'd watched it happen to MySpace, then to Friendster before that. Social networks die when they stop being where the culture happens. Facebook was approaching middle age, and in internet years, middle age meant obsolescence wasn't far behind. He needed something transformative, not an incremental improvement or a new feature, but a complete reinvention. He needed to change the conversation from, "Is Facebook destroying democracy?" to, "What comes next after Facebook?" The answer, he decided, was the metaverse. The term had been around for decades. coined by science fiction author Neil Stephenson in his 1992 novel Snow Crash. It described a virtual reality successor to the internet, a three-dimensional digital world where people would work, play, socialize, exist as avatars rather than profiles. It was the kind of ambitious future-facing idea that Silicon Valley loved. Huge potential, enormous technical challenges, unclear path to profitability. Mark had been thinking about VR since acquiring Oculus in 2014. He'd tried the early headsets and seen glimpses of possibility. The technology was clunky, expensive, often nauseating. But Mark needed to believe, that these were temporary problems, that VR was inevitable as the next computing platform after mobile, that whoever controlled the metaverse would control the future of human interaction. In October 2021, he made the announcement. Facebook was changing its name to Meta. The company would still own Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, but these would become products within a larger corporate entity focused on building the metaverse. Mark declared that within 10 years, the metaverse would reach 1 billion people and host hundreds of billions of dollars in digital commerce. The rebrand was met with skepticism bordering on mockery. Critics pointed out that you can't escape accountability by changing your name, that calling yourself Meta didn't erase Facebook's history of privacy violations and enabling harm, that it looked like a desperate attempt to distract from current problems by promising a science fiction future. But Mark was committed. He began spending billions, eventually tens of billions, on Reality Labs. Meta's division focused on VR and AR hardware. He demonstrated the company's vision in a series of promotional videos that quickly became memes. In one video, his avatar, a cartoonish legless digital version of himself, appeared in front of a virtual Eiffel Tower, looking unsettlingly vacant and dead-eyed. The internet erupted in ridicule. The graphics looked worse than video games from the 1990s. The whole thing felt dystopian rather than utopian. Why would anyone want to attend meetings or socialize as crude avatars in a virtual office when they could just use Zoom or see people in person? Mark seemed genuinely hurt by the mockery. He responded by promising better graphics, more realistic avatars, more compelling use cases, but he couldn't explain in any satisfying way why the metaverse was necessary. What problem did it solve? Who was asking for this? The truth was that the metaverse solved Mark's problem more than users' problems. It gave him a new frontier, unregulated and unconquered, where he could rebuild his reputation and Facebook's future, away from the burning wreckage of the social media wars. It let him position himself as a visionary again, rather than an apologist. It let him talk about the future instead of defending the past. The financial costs were staggering. Reality Labs lost $10 billion in 2021, $13 billion in 2022. The losses continued into 2023 and beyond. Meta's stock price cratered. Investors were furious. Employees were laid off by the thousands. Mark called it a year of efficiency, while he continued pouring money into the metaverse bet. He tried to explain the logic. Every computing platform shift created new giants and destroyed old ones. Microsoft had dominated personal computers, but largely missed mobile. Google had dominated search and advertising, but was at risk of missing VR/AR. Mark didn't want Facebook, now Meta, to be the company that dominated social networking, but missed the next platform shift. This reasoning was sound in the abstract, but it required the metaverse to actually become the next platform, and there was little evidence that consumers wanted it. Oculus Quest headsets sold modestly, a few million units a year, respectable for a new technology, but nowhere near the billions Mark needed to justify the investment. The technical challenges were immense. VR headsets were still heavy, uncomfortable for extended use, isolated you from the real world, and made many people nauseous. The computing power required to create convincing virtual environments was enormous. Haptic feedback and realistic avatars and seamless interoperability between virtual spaces. All of this remained years or decades away from being solved. But Mark was undeterred. He hosted an internal meeting where he told employees that he was willing to lose billions per year for the next decade building the metaverse. That this was an existential bet for the company. That they either succeeded in building the future or became irrelevant. Some employees found this inspiring. Many found it terrifying. They were being laid off, their projects canceled, their resources constrained, all while Mark poured unlimited money into a vision that might never materialize. Mark's pivot to the metaverse revealed something about his psychology. He was more comfortable building toward a distant future than managing the messy present. The metaverse was abstract, aspirational, a blank canvas where he could imagine unlimited possibilities. Facebook's current problems were concrete, urgent, political, requiring constant negotiation with regulators and critics, and users who hated what the platform had become. Building toward the future, let him be the visionary founder again. Managing present-day Facebook made him a target. The choice, from his perspective, was obvious. But the pivot also revealed the limits of founder control. Mark had structured Meta so that he could make any decision he wanted without being overruled. This was useful when it meant he could pursue long-term bets that shareholders might oppose. It was dangerous when it meant no one could stop him from pursuing a fantasy that was destroying shareholder value. By 2023, Meta had spent over $30 billion on the metaverse with little to show for it. Horizon Worlds, Meta's flagship metaverse platform, had fewer than 300,000 monthly active users. For comparison, Facebook had 3 billion. Instagram had over a billion. Meta had spent tens of billions to build something that had captured less than 0.01% of its existing user base. The press coverage was brutal. Mark was depicted as delusional, a CEO who'd lost touch with reality, who was squandering shareholder money on a science fiction fantasy, while his core businesses faced existential threats from TikTok and regulatory crackdowns. But something interesting happened. While Reality Labs hemorrhaged money, Meta's core business, advertising on Facebook and Instagram, continued printing money. Not at the growth rates of earlier years, but still enormously profitably. The company was making enough from ads to fund the metaverse losses and still generate billions in profit. Mark used this to argue that critics didn't understand long-term thinking, that Amazon had lost money for years before becoming dominant, that the iPhone had been mocked initially, that every transformational technology looked foolish until suddenly it didn't. These comparisons were misleading. The iPhone solved clear problems. It put the internet in your pocket. It was beautiful. It worked. The metaverse didn't solve obvious problems, wasn't beautiful, and largely didn't work. But Mark couldn't or wouldn't see the difference. The pivot to the metaverse was many things. It was a genuine bet on the future of computing. It was an attempt to escape regulatory pressure by changing the subject. It was Mark's way of reclaiming the narrative, of being the builder rather than the defendant. It was perhaps also a form of escapism, building an alternate reality because the actual reality had become too unpleasant to face. Mark was approaching 40. He'd spent more than half his life building Facebook. He'd experienced more success than most people could imagine, and more criticism than most people could withstand. The company he'd created as a college project had become one of the most powerful and controversial institutions on Earth. And now he was trying to leave it behind. Not literally. He was still CEO of Meta, still responsible for Facebook and Instagram, and all the problems they caused. But psychologically, he was checking out. He was living in the future, in virtual spaces that didn't yet exist, surrounded by avatars and possibilities rather than regulators and responsibilities. The pivot was Mark's way of saying, I don't want to be the Facebook guy anymore. I want to be the metaverse guy. I want to build rather than defend. I want to be visionary rather than villain. Whether the metaverse would work remained unclear. Most analysts were skeptical. Most users were indifferent. Most competitors were building their own versions, which meant even if VR did become the next platform, Meta wouldn't necessarily dominate it. But Mark had made his choice. He'd rather bet everything on an uncertain future than continue managing an unmanageable present. He'd rather lose billions pursuing his vision than succeed at managing a company he no longer believed in. The lonely programmer who had built Facebook to connect people had discovered that connection at scale was far more complicated and troubling than he'd imagined. So he was building a new world, a virtual one, where maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Where connection could be what he'd always wanted it to be: pure, frictionless, free from the messy complications of human nature. Where he could start over and get it right this time, or at least escape the consequences of getting it wrong the first time. Chapter 11: The Metaverse Bet. There's a photograph from 2016 taken at a Samsung product launch that became instantly iconic for all the wrong reasons. Mark Zuckerberg walks down an aisle between rows of seated people. He's smiling, confident, moving through the crowd. But everyone around him is wearing VR headsets. They're sitting motionless, faces covered by bulky black visors, completely absorbed in whatever they're seeing through the lenses. They can't see Mark. They can't see each other. They're alone together, physically present, but mentally elsewhere. The image was meant to show VR's promise. Instead, it became a metaphor for dystopia. One man, visible and aware, walking through a room of people who'd voluntarily blinded themselves. The tech press called it creepy, Orwellian, a preview of a future no one wanted. Mark didn't see it that way. He saw people experiencing something amazing. He saw the future of presence, the ability to feel like you're somewhere else, someone else, without the constraints of physical reality. He saw liberation from the tyranny of geography and bodies and the limits of the physical world. This disconnect between what Mark saw as possibility and what others saw as warning would define the entire metaverse project. By 2022, Meta was spending more on reality labs than most countries spent on their entire technology sectors. The division had grown to include thousands of engineers, designers, researchers. They were working on VR headsets, Arkansas glasses, haptic gloves, full body tracking, avatar systems, virtual economies, spatial audio, photorealistic rendering engines. They were trying to solve problems that academics had been working on for decades, and they were trying to solve them all simultaneously. Mark believed the metaverse needed to be compelling, and compelling meant realistic. Not realistic like a cartoon or a video game, but realistic like actual reality. Avatars needed to show facial expressions, body language, subtle emotional cues. Virtual spaces needed to feel present, three-dimensional, convincing. You needed to forget you were wearing a headset and believe, even for moments, that you were actually there. The technical challenges were almost comical in their complexity. Human faces have 43 muscles that create thousands of possible expressions. Capturing these in real time, translating them to an avatar, and displaying them without lag required processing power that didn't exist in consumer hardware. Bodies move in infinitely variable ways. Eyes track and focus. Hands gesture. Hair moves. Clothing drapes and wrinkles. Simulating all of this in real time was computationally prohibitive. So the early metaverse was crude. Avatars were legless, floating torsos with minimal facial expressions and jerky movements. Virtual rooms were empty spaces with flat textures. The whole thing looked and felt less like the future and more like a bad video game from 20 years ago. Mark kept promising improvements. He demonstrated newer avatars with legs, This was presented as a breakthrough, which itself was telling about how primitive the technology still was. He showed photorealistic avatars created by scanning people's faces, though these required specialized equipment and processing power far beyond consumer devices. He talked about haptic suits that would let you feel virtual objects, about AR glasses that would overlay digital information on the real world. But all of this was years or decades away from mass adoption. In the meantime, Meta was asking people to strap bulky headsets to their faces, isolate themselves from physical reality, and spend time as cartoon versions of themselves in mostly empty virtual spaces. The use cases remained unclear. Meta's promotional materials showed people attending virtual meetings, which seemed like a worse version of Zoom. They showed people playing simple games, which seemed like a worse version of actual video games. They showed people hanging out in virtual spaces, which seemed like a worse version of actually hanging out. Mark argued that presence was the killer feature, that being in a virtual space with someone felt fundamentally different from a video call, that eye contact and spatial audio and the sense of being together in 3 dimensions created intimacy that flat screens couldn't match. Some people who tried VR agreed with this. There were moments, usually brief, where the technology delivered on the promise, where you'd forget you were wearing a headset and actually feel present in the virtual space, where a conversation with someone's avatar felt almost as real as a conversation with their physical body. But these moments were fragile and rare. A glitch would break the illusion. The headset would shift uncomfortably. Your eyes would strain from the close-up displays. You'd remember you were standing in your living room wearing a heavy device on your face, cut off from everything real. The metaverse had a deeper problem, one Mark seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge. It was solving a problem that most people didn't have. The pandemic had forced millions into remote work and video calls, and people had largely hated it. They tolerated Zoom because they had to, not because they wanted to. The moment they could return to physical offices and in-person meetings, many did. The metaverse was proposing that people should spend even more time in digital spaces, even more disconnected from physical reality. It was offering to make the isolation of the pandemic permanent, to turn the emergency workaround into the default mode of human interaction. This made sense if you were Mark Zuckerberg. He'd built his entire life around digital spaces. He was more comfortable with code than small talk, more fluent in systems thinking than emotional intelligence. The metaverse was his natural habitat. Of course, he wanted everyone else to join him there. But most people weren't Mark Zuckerberg. They didn't prefer digital interaction to physical presence. They used social media to supplement real relationships, not replace them. The idea of spending hours in VR when you could just talk to people in person or pick up the phone, it didn't make sense unless you were already predisposed to prefer digital mediation. The financial markets began to panic. Meta's stock price had fallen by more than 60% from its peak. The company had lost hundreds of billions in market value. Investors were demanding that Mark stop hemorrhaging money on the metaverse and focus on the profitable core business. Some called for him to be removed as CEO. But Mark couldn't be removed. He'd structured the company's voting shares to give him majority control. He could ignore the shareholders, ignore the board, ignore everyone. This was exactly what he'd designed the system to allow, the ability to pursue long-term bets, even when short-term results looked terrible. The question was whether this was visionary persistence or stubborn delusion. History would remember him either as the person who saw the future when everyone else was blind, or as the billionaire who squandered hundreds of billions on a fantasy that never materialized. Mark doubled down. In 2023, he released Quest 3, an improved VR headset with better resolution, mixed reality capabilities, and a lower price point. Reviews were positive, relatively speaking. It was the best consumer VR device available. But Best available didn't mean good enough to drive mass adoption. Sales were modest. The metaverse remained a niche product for enthusiasts and early adopters. He began talking about artificial intelligence as the key to making the metaverse work. AI could generate virtual environments procedurally, could animate avatars realistically, could create NPCs that felt alive, could translate language in real time. AI could solve the content problem, the fact that virtual worlds felt empty because creating everything by hand was too expensive and time-consuming. This was actually plausible. AI was advancing rapidly, and Meta was investing heavily in it. But it also meant the metaverse bet was becoming contingent on another technology bet. You had to believe VR would become mainstream, and AI would become good enough to populate it with compelling content and realistic avatars. Each of these was a big bet. Together, they were astronomical. Mark's personal life had become increasingly focused on the future he was trying to build. He spent hours in VR, testing products, experiencing the metaverse as users would. He hosted meetings in Horizon workrooms. He gave interviews as his avatar. He was living in the future, or at least living in a crude prototype of the future. Priscilla, his wife, seemed to tolerate this with patient skepticism. She was the doctor, grounded in physical reality, in bodies and medicine, and helping actual people with actual problems. She'd watched Mark build Facebook, watched him weather the scandals and stress and criticism. Now she was watching him pour his energy and their wealth into virtual worlds. They had 2 daughters. Mark talked about building the metaverse for their generation, for a future where his children would grow up with virtual and physical reality seamlessly blended. But there was something sad about this. He was absent from the present, mentally, emotionally, while trying to build a better future. His daughters had a father who was physically present, but psychologically living in a world that didn't yet exist. The critics multiplied. Tech journalists wrote pieces arguing that the metaverse was dead before it arrived, that VR had been the next big thing for 30 years and would remain perpetually 5 years away. Business analysts questioned the entire strategy. Ethicists worried about addiction, about people retreating from reality into virtual spaces, about the psychological impact of spending hours as avatars. Mark's response was always the same. Wait. The technology would improve. The experiences would become more compelling. The ecosystem would mature. Network effects would kick in. Once enough people were in the metaverse, everyone else would need to join to stay connected. It was the same pattern that had made Facebook inevitable. But Facebook had been free, accessible from any web browser, and solved an obvious problem: staying in touch with people. The metaverse required expensive hardware, made you look ridiculous, and solved problems that most people didn't know they had. Mark turned 39, then 40. He'd been CEO of Facebook, now Meta, for 2 decades. He'd created one of the most successful companies in history, and one of the most controversial. He'd become one of the richest people on earth, and one of the most criticized. And now he was betting it all on a vision that most people thought was folly. There was something almost admirable about it. The willingness to risk everything on a belief. The refusal to play it safe or coast on past success. The sheer audacity of trying to build an entirely new computing platform from scratch, while regulators were trying to break up your current business. But there was also something tragic. Mark had never been able to enjoy what he'd built. Facebook reached 1 billion users, and instead of celebration, there were lawsuits and scandals. It reached 2 billion users, and there were election interference investigations. 3 billion, and there were calls to break up the company. At every milestone, the achievement was overshadowed by the consequences. So he was trying to build something new, something that couldn't be tainted by Facebook's reputation because it would be fundamentally different. A fresh start, a chance to be the visionary founder again rather than the embattled CEO defending indefensible positions. The metaverse was Mark's escape route, not from Meta. He was still running the company, but from being Mark Zuckerberg, the guy who broke democracy and enabled genocide and turned human connection into surveillance capitalism. In the metaverse, he could be someone else, an avatar, a builder, a visionary. Not the man who'd built Facebook, but the man who would build whatever came next. Whether that next thing would actually arrive remained uncertain. The technology was improving slowly. Competitors like Apple were entering the space with their own visions and products. The barriers to adoptions remained high. The use cases remained unclear. But Mark had made his bet. He'd committed billions, and his reputation and his legacy. He was all in. Because the alternative, accepting that Facebook was his legacy, that he'd be remembered primarily for the harm it caused, rather than the connections it enabled, was unbearable. Better to fail building the future than succeed managing the past. Better to lose everything pursuing a vision than preserve everything while admitting the vision had been flawed from the start. The lonely programmer who had built Facebook to solve isolation was now building virtual worlds where you could escape reality entirely, where you could be anyone, anywhere, free from the constraints of body and geography and identity, where you could finally, fully, completely disconnect from the messy, complicated, uncontrollable reality of actually being human. And call it connection. Chapter 12. The Man Behind the Meme. There's a moment that's been turned into 1,000 AE, GIFs, and internet jokes. Mark Zuckerberg testifying before Congress in 2018, sitting unnaturally still, his expression flat and unchanging, his responses precise and robotic. Someone edited the video to make his eyes blink irregularly. Someone else added the sound of mechanical whirring. The internet collectively decided he was either a lizard person, an android, or an alien pretending to be human. The joke was cruel but revealing. Something about Mark's public persona triggered an uncanny valley response in people. He looked human. He sounded human. But something was off. The affect was wrong. The social cues were missing. He seemed to be performing humanity rather than embodying it. This caricature, Mark as robot, as inhuman tech overlord, became the dominant narrative. Late-night comedians mocked his awkwardness. Journalists analyzed his body language and facial expressions, searching for signs of emotion or warmth. The consensus was that Mark Zuckerberg was brilliant but broken, a person who understood code better than people, who saw humans as data points rather than as actual humans. But beneath the meme was a real person, and that person was more complicated and more human than the caricature suggested. Mark had always been awkward. Even before Facebook, even as a child, he'd struggled with social interaction in ways that came naturally to others. He was shy, intense, more comfortable with computers than conversations. His parents had worried about him. His teachers had noted his exceptional intelligence and his difficulty making friends. In another era, this would have been unremarkable. Plenty of brilliant people are socially awkward. They become mathematicians or engineers or researchers, careers where technical skill matters more than charm. But Mark had done something unusual. He'd become the CEO of a social company, despite being profoundly unsocial himself. Mirth. The irony was almost too perfect. The person who built the world's largest social network was someone who found actual socializing difficult and exhausting. He created tools for connection because he struggled with connection. He built systems for human interaction because human interaction without systems confused and overwhelmed him. There were glimpses occasionally of a different Mark. With Priscilla, he was warmer, more relaxed. In videos of them together, you could see him smile genuinely, laugh unselfconsciously, be present in a way he never was during interviews or congressional hearings. She brought out something in him that the public never saw. With his daughters, Max and August, he was tender. He posted photos of them, carefully curated, conscious of privacy, in a way that seemed hypocritical given Facebook's history, doing normal parent-child things, reading books, playing in the yard. He'd taken paternity leave, which was unusual for a CEO, especially one running a company as large as Meta. He talked about wanting to be present for his children in ways his work often prevented. He'd also made a pledge to give away 99% of his wealth. He and Priscilla had signed the giving pledge and created the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, committing billions to education, scientific research, criminal justice reform. The skeptics said this was reputation laundering, a way to rebrand from tech villain to philanthropist. But the money was real. The commitment was real. Whatever his motivations, the impact would be substantial. Mark's relationship with money had always been unusual for someone so wealthy. He lived modestly, by billionaire standards. His house in Palo Alto was large, but not ostentatious. He wore the same gray t-shirts and jeans every day. He'd ordered dozens of identical outfits so he didn't have to think about what to wear. His most extravagant purchase was probably his Hawaii property, and even that generated controversy when local residents protested his attempts to increase privacy. He didn't collect cars or yachts or art. He didn't party with other billionaires or seek status through luxury. His wealth was abstract, mostly tied up in Meta stock, relevant primarily for what it enabled, the ability to pursue long-term bets like the metaverse without worrying about profitability. But Mark's relationship with power was more complicated. He'd accumulated more power than almost anyone in modern history. He controlled how billions of people communicated, what information they saw, how they understood reality. He'd structured Meta's governance to ensure no one could overrule him. He'd resisted regulation, fought antitrust investigations, and repeatedly insisted that he knew better than governments what was good for his users. This concentration of power would have corrupted most people. It probably corrupted Mark too, though the ways were subtle. Not through cartoon villainy. He didn't seem motivated by greed or cruelty, but through the slow erosion of doubt. When you're right, as often as Mark had been right, when you build something as successful as Facebook, you start to trust your judgment absolutely. You stop listening to critics because critics have always been wrong before. You surround yourself with people who believe in your vision because skeptics are exhausting. Mark had created an echo chamber as sophisticated as any on his platforms, but his wasn't algorithmic. It was organizational. The structure of Meta ensured that dissent was difficult. His control was absolute. His vision was law. And so he became increasingly isolated in his certainty, unable to hear the warnings because the system he'd built was designed to filter them out. The people who'd known him longest saw the changes. College friends who remembered the 19-year-old with big ideas noted how much harder he'd become. Former employees talked about how he'd evolved from awkward founder to calculating executive. The casual cruelty of those early instant messages, "They trust me, dumb fucks," had been refined into corporate ruthlessness, but the underlying impulse remained. Yet there were also moments of unexpected vulnerability, when the criticisms became overwhelming, when the whistleblowers came forward, when his own employees staged protests. Mark seemed genuinely hurt, not just strategically concerned about PR, but personally wounded that people didn't understand what he was trying to do. He believed, truly believed, that he was trying to help, that Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, despite their flaws, had made the world better, that the metaverse would make it better still. This belief, this sincere conviction that he was doing good, made him more dangerous, not less. A cynical villain knows he's causing harm and does it anyway. Mark caused harm while believing he was helping. He couldn't see the damage because he was too focused on the vision. The lives destroyed by misinformation were unfortunate externalities. The democracies destabilized were growing pains. The teenagers driven to self-harm by Instagram were outliers that better AI would eventually prevent. He'd learned to mimic empathy in public statements, to say the right words about taking responsibility, about caring about users, about wanting to make things better. But there was a flatness to these statements, a sense that he was performing the emotion rather than feeling it. Not because he was a sociopath, but because his natural mode was systems thinking, not emotional connection. Mark could understand suffering abstractly. He could look at data showing harm and recognize it was a problem, but he struggled to feel it viscerally, to understand what it meant for an individual to be harassed, surveilled, manipulated by systems he'd created. The gap between abstract understanding and emotional comprehension was the gap that made him simultaneously brilliant and dangerous. By his 40th birthday, Mark had lived most of his adult life under intense scrutiny. He'd been praised and vilified, celebrated and investigated, held up as a visionary and condemned as a threat. He'd accumulated wealth and power that would have seemed impossible when he started, and he'd paid for it with his privacy, his reputation, and perhaps his humanity. The meme version of Mark, the robot, the lizard person, the emotionless automaton, was unfair, but not entirely wrong. He'd become something inhuman, not because he'd started that way, but because the pressure and isolation and sheer weight of running Meta had ground away the softer parts of him. He'd optimized himself for the role, removing anything that didn't serve the mission. He'd built Facebook to solve loneliness, and in the process, he'd become perhaps the loneliest person in Silicon Valley, isolated by wealth, by power, by the fact that almost everyone who interacted with him wanted something: money, access, approval, a job. Real friendship was nearly impossible. Real connection required vulnerability, and vulnerability was a luxury he couldn't afford. So he built the metaverse, a place where he could be an avatar, where the awkwardness didn't matter, where social interaction could be mediated by systems that made sense to him. A place where everyone was equally isolated in their headsets, equally dependent on technology to facilitate connection. A place where his natural habitat, digital spaces, would become everyone's habitat. The man behind the meme was more human than his critics acknowledged, and less human than he believed himself to be. He was brilliant and limited, visionary and blind, capable of seeing the future and incapable of understanding the present. He was someone who'd wanted to bring people together and had instead created systems that pushed them apart while keeping them connected. Someone who'd solved loneliness by making it universal, by ensuring that everyone could be lonely together, scrolling through feeds, comparing lives, performing connection while feeling increasingly isolated. Mark Zuckerberg, at 40, was a man who'd gotten exactly what he wanted and discovered that what he wanted had been shaped by who he was. Someone who preferred code to conversation, systems to relationships, the mediated to the immediate. Someone who'd mistaken the desire for connection itself. Someone who'd built tools for bridging distance and discovered that some distances can't be bridged by technology, only by the messy, difficult, irreducibly human work of actually being present with another person. The work he'd spent his entire life trying to make unnecessary. The work the metaverse was designed to replace. The work that perhaps he'd never learned to do. Chapter 13. Legacy in Real Time. Most people don't get to watch their legacy being written while they're still alive. Most founders are judged by history after they're gone, when the full consequences of their work have unfolded, when time has provided the distance necessary for perspective. Mark didn't have that luxury. His legacy was being written in real time, in congressional hearings and think pieces and academic studies and leaked documents. Every day brought new analyses of what Facebook had done to democracy, to mental health, to truth itself. Every day someone was writing the history of his impact while he was still in the middle of building it. This created a strange temporal paradox. He was simultaneously the protagonist of a story still unfolding and the villain of a story that had supposedly already ended. The narrative had hardened. Mark Zuckerberg built Facebook. It connected billions of people. It broke democracy and enabled authoritarianism and made everyone lonely and depressed. The end. Even though the actual story was still being written. Number 6. He fought against this narrative constantly. In interviews, in posts, in speeches, he tried to offer a more nuanced version. Yes, there were problems, but there were also benefits. Facebook had helped organize the Arab Spring, had let families stay connected across continents, had given small businesses access to customers they could never have reached otherwise. 2 billion people chose to use Facebook every day. That had to mean something. But nuance doesn't survive contact with the internet. The story that spread was simpler, more satisfying. Brilliant, but socially awkward programmer builds social network, gets rich, refuses to take responsibility for harm caused, becomes symbol of tech industry's arrogance and hubris. This story was partly true. The question was whether it was complete. Mark had begun to study how history remembers controversial figures. He read about John D. Rockefeller, who'd been reviled as a robber baron during his lifetime, but whose philanthropic legacy eventually rehabilitated his reputation. About Alfred Nobel, who invented dynamite and watched it be used for destruction, then created the Nobel Prizes to reshape how we'd be remembered. About Oppenheimer, who built the atomic bomb and spent the rest of his life grappling with what he'd created. These comparisons were perhaps grandiose, but they reflected something real. Mark's growing awareness that the technology he'd built had consequences beyond what he'd intended or anticipated. That intentions didn't absolve you of outcomes. That "I was just trying to connect people" wasn't an adequate response to "you helped destabilize democracy." The historical assessments were already appearing. Books had been written, multiple books, analyzing Facebook's impact. Some were balanced, acknowledging both benefits and harms. Many were damning, treating Facebook as a case study in how good intentions and unchecked power create catastrophe. Academic researchers were publishing papers showing correlations between Facebook use and depression, between social media and political polarization, between algorithmic amplification and the spread of misinformation. Not all of these studies were rigorous, not all held up to scrutiny, but collectively, they created an overwhelming impression. Facebook had hurt people, lots of people, in ways that were measurable and significant. Mark could challenge individual studies. He could point to methodological flaws, confounding variables, correlation versus causation, but he couldn't challenge the broader pattern. Something had gone wrong. The thing he'd built to bring people together had, in many cases, pushed them apart. The openness he'd celebrated had been weaponized. The connection he'd facilitated had often been shallow, performative, exhausting. The question was why, and here the assessments diverged. Some critics argued that Facebook was inherently harmful, that any system designed to maximize engagement would inevitably promote divisive content, that the business model, surveillance advertising, was incompatible with user well-being, that the whole edifice was rotten from the foundation. Others argued that Facebook was a tool that reflected human nature, that people were tribal and emotional and easily manipulated, and Facebook just made these tendencies visible and scalable. That blaming Facebook for society's problems was like blaming the telephone for hate speech or the printing press for propaganda. Mark preferred the second interpretation. It let him off the hook, at least partially. Facebook wasn't the problem. Human nature was the problem. Facebook was just a mirror, and people didn't like what they saw. But this interpretation ignored Facebook's role in shaping what people saw. The algorithms weren't neutral mirrors. They were funhouse mirrors that distorted and amplified certain aspects of reality while hiding others. They showed you more of what made you angry or afraid or engaged, regardless of whether that content was true or healthy or good for society. The legacy question haunted Mark in ways he rarely discussed publicly. He was 40 years old. He'd probably live another 40 or 50 years, maybe longer, given his wealth and access to health care. He'd spend the rest of his life being Mark Zuckerberg, the guy who built Facebook. Every conversation, every introduction, every interaction would be filtered through that identity. And what would that identity mean? What would people think when they heard his name 50 years from now? Would he be remembered as someone who connected the world, or as someone who broke it? The answer depended partly on what happened next. If democracy survived, if social media evolved into something healthier, if the metaverse succeeded and proved that Mark could learn from past mistakes and build something better, the story wasn't over. The legacy wasn't fixed. But it was getting harder to change the narrative. The scandals had accumulated. The harm had been documented. The trustworthy sources, researchers, journalists, whistleblowers, kept reaching the same conclusions. Facebook had prioritized growth over safety, engagement over well-being, profit over responsibility. Mark had started to talk more explicitly about legacy, not in a defensive way, but in a reflective one. He gave interviews where he acknowledged mistakes, said he wished he'd moved faster on certain problems, admitted that running a company at Facebook's scale was beyond what anyone was prepared for. These acknowledgments were more honest than his earlier defenses, but they raised a troubling question. If he knew the problems were serious, if he acknowledged the harm, why didn't he make more fundamental changes? Why not abandon the engagement-driven business model? Why not give users more control, even if it meant less profit? Why not slow down, fix things properly, prioritize safety over growth? The answer, though Mark would never state it plainly, was that he couldn't. Not because of shareholders, he had voting control and could ignore them, but because changing Facebook's fundamental model would mean it omitted Sync. The model had been wrong from the start. It would mean decades of work had been in service of something harmful. It would mean his legacy was already written, and nothing he did could revise it. So he pivoted to the metaverse instead, built something new rather than fix something broken, looked forward rather than back. This was psychologically easier. It let him keep believing that he was a builder, a visionary, someone working toward human flourishing, rather than someone who'd already caused harm that couldn't be undone. The historians were already making comparisons to other technological transitions. The printing press had enabled the Reformation, but also religious wars. Railways had connected continents, but also enabled colonialism and warfare at unprecedented scale. Nuclear power had provided energy, but also the capacity for global annihilation. Technology was never neutral. It created possibilities and dangers in equal measure. The question was whether the builders of these technologies bore responsibility for how they were used. Mark's answer had evolved over time. Early on, he'd insisted that Facebook was just a tool, neutral in itself, responsible only for what users did with it. But this position had become untenable as the harms multiplied. Now his answer was more nuanced, but also more tortured. Facebook bore some responsibility, yes, but not all of it. Society bore responsibility. Users bore responsibility. Bad actors bore responsibility. The harm was distributed across so many actors that no one person or company could be held fully accountable. This was intellectually defensible, but morally unsatisfying. It felt like avoiding responsibility by spreading it so thin that no one was responsible. It felt like the kind of argument that lets you sleep at night while the world burned. But perhaps that was unfair. Perhaps Mark was genuinely doing the best he could with an impossible situation. Managing a platform with 3 billion users, each with different norms and needs and contexts, was genuinely unprecedented. No one had a playbook. No one knew the right answers. He was making it up as he went along, trying to balance competing values: free speech and safety, growth and responsibility, innovation and stability. The tragedy was that his best wasn't good enough. not because he was lazy or malicious, but because the problem was genuinely harder than any one person, no matter how smart or well-intentioned, could solve. Facebook had grown beyond human scale. It was now a system, an ecosystem, a force that no longer fully responded to Mark's intentions. He'd built a machine he couldn't fully control, and now he'd be remembered not for building it, but for failing to control it. Not for the vision that started it, but for the harm that followed. The legacy was being written in real time, while he watched, and there was very little he could do to change it. He could build the metaverse. He could give away his wealth. He could spend the rest of his life trying to atone, trying to build better, trying to show that he'd learned. But the first chapter was already written. The damage was already done. The verdict, if not final, was increasingly clear. Mark Zuckerberg had built something that connected billions of people, and in doing so, he'd revealed something uncomfortable about human nature and technology and the unintended consequences of solving problems at scale. He'd shown that connection without wisdom is dangerous, that platforms without accountability are weapons, that bringing people together is not inherently good if you don't consider who they become when they're together. The lonely programmer who'd started this in a dorm room had gotten what he wanted. Everyone connected, everyone visible, everyone performing their lives for an audience of everyone else. And the world was discovering that maybe, just maybe, some distance between people had been healthy. Some privacy had been protective. Some disconnection had been necessary. Too late now. The connection had been made. The systems were running. The legacy was being written. And Mark was still here, watching it unfold, unable to change the past, uncertain about the future, living in real time with the consequences of what he'd built. Chapter 14. The blue glow returns. Picture a room at night. The blue glow of a screen illuminating a face. Not a dorm room this time, an office or a home, somewhere comfortable and private. Not a laptop, maybe a phone, maybe a tablet, maybe a VR headset showing virtual spaces that don't quite exist yet. The scene is familiar. You've lived this scene. We all have. The late night scroll through feeds, checking notifications, seeing what everyone else is doing while you sit alone in the dark. The blue light that keeps you awake, that pulls you back, that promises connection, but delivers something else. A hollow engagement, a substitute for presence, a way of being with people while being utterly alone. This is what Mark built, not intentionally, not maliciously, but inevitably. Because the lonely programmer building tools to connect people was always himself lonely. And what he built reflected that loneliness, codified it, made it universal. 20 years after that first night in the dorm room, after Facebook reached billions of users, after the scandals and the hearings and the attempts to build something new, the fundamental pattern remained unchanged. A person, a screen, the blue glow, the desire to reach across distance, and the discovery that the distance is still there, maybe greater than before, hidden now behind the illusion of connection. Mark is in his 40s now. He has a family. He has wealth beyond measure. He has power that would make historical emperors weep with envy. And he still has the same problem he started with. How do you make people see you? How do you reach across the space between one person and another and make something real happen? The metaverse is his latest answer. A virtual world where the screens disappear, where you're not looking at social interaction, but supposedly experiencing it, where avatars replace profiles, where presence replaces posts, where the mediation becomes so complete that you forget you're being mediated. But it's still the same impulse, the same lonely programmer, older now, and wealthier and more sophisticated, still trying to solve loneliness with technology, still believing that the right code, the right system, the right platform will finally bridge the gap between human and human. The question that Mark spent 20 years avoiding was whether technology could actually solve this problem, whether connection through screens, no matter how advanced, could replace the messy, difficult, irreplaceable experience of being physically present with another person. Whether the distance he'd spent his life trying to eliminate with code was actually essential, protective even, to genuine intimacy. Because there's a paradox at the heart of social media and the metaverse and every platform Mark ever built. They promise to eliminate loneliness by connecting everyone, but they might actually increase loneliness by replacing genuine connection with its simulation, by making us all visible to each other, but never truly seen, by letting us share everything except the parts that matter most. Facebook didn't invent loneliness. Human beings have always struggled with isolation, with the gap between who we are and who we present ourselves to be, with the hunger to be known and the fear of being known too well. These are ancient problems, as old as consciousness itself. But Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp and whatever the metaverse becomes, they've changed how we experience these problems. They've made loneliness more visible by surrounding it with the performance of connection. They've made isolation more acute by showing us constantly everyone else's curated happiness. They've made the gap between reality and presentation so wide that we no longer know which side we're on. Mark never meant to do this. That much, at least, seems true. He was 19 years old, awkward and brilliant, building something he thought would help. And it did help, in ways. It reconnected old friends. It let families stay in touch across continents. It gave voice to people who'd been voiceless. It organized movements and revolutions. It saved lives. But it also cost lives, enabled violence, spread lies, broke democracies, drove teenagers to self-harm, turned human attention into a commodity and human connection into data, made billions of people's loneliness profitable. The balance sheet is still being calculated. Maybe it always will be. Maybe technology this large, this consequential, can never be simply good or bad. Maybe it's both, simultaneously, irreducibly complex in its impacts. But what's certain is that Mark's solution to loneliness became, for many people, a cause of loneliness. That the thing built to connect people left them feeling more disconnected. That the grand project of making the world more open and connected revealed something uncomfortable. That some openness is exposure. That some connection is exploitation. That bringing everyone together doesn't necessarily make anyone less alone. Mark is still building, still trying. The metaverse may succeed or fail, but either way, there will be something after it. Another platform, another system, another attempt to solve with code what might be unsolvable by any means. Because building is what he knows. Building is what makes sense to him. The alternative, accepting that some problems don't have technological solutions, that some human experiences can't be optimized or scaled or improved through better systems, is intolerable. So the blue glow continues. Different devices, different platforms, different promises, but always the same core offering. You don't have to be alone. You can be connected to everyone. All the time. Just look at the screen. Just put on the headset. Just trust the algorithm to show you what matters. And maybe that's enough for some people. Maybe the simulation of connection is better than nothing. Maybe being alone together is better than being alone. Or maybe we're all slowly discovering what Mark has known his entire life. That loneliness can't be coded away. That the person most isolated by Facebook's success was the person who built it. That connecting billions of people left him more alone than ever, trapped in a role he couldn't escape, performing connection while missing it entirely. Picture that dorm room again. 20 years ago, before the billions of users and the congressional hearings and the metaverse, just a 19-year-old with a laptop trying to solve a problem that was really his own problem, building a tool that was really a mirror. If you could go back to that moment, what would you tell him? Would you warn him about what's coming? About the harm and the scrutiny and the legacy he'll spend his life defending? Would you tell him to build something different, something safer, something smaller? Or would you let him build it anyway, knowing that the connection, real and simulated, helpful and harmful, beautiful and terrible, was inevitable? That someone would build Facebook if Mark didn't? That the lonely impulse to reach across distance is as old as humanity, and technology was always going to become the mediator. We're all in that dorm room now, in a sense. All of us with our screens, our blue glows, our carefully curated lives, presented to audiences we partly know and partly don't. All of us building our own versions of Facebook, our own profiles and posts and performances of connection. All of us trying to solve the same problem Mark was trying to solve. How do you make people see you? How do you reach across the gap between self and other? How do you be less alone? The answers aren't in the code. They never were. They're in the messy, difficult, irreducibly human work of actual presence, of putting down the screen, of being with someone, really with them, without mediation or curation or the safety of distance. Mark built tools to avoid doing this work, and billions of us accepted those tools gratefully because we wanted to avoid it too. We wanted the connection without the vulnerability, the visibility without the risk, the togetherness without the discomfort of actually being together. And we got exactly what we asked for. A world where everyone is connected and everyone is lonely. Where we're never alone but rarely together. Where the blue glow illuminates our faces but not our lives. The screen is still glowing. Somewhere, everywhere, always. Billions of faces in billions of rooms, all bathed in blue light, all scrolling, all searching, all hoping that the next post, the next notification, the next connection will finally be the one that makes them feel less alone. It won't be. It never is. But we keep looking anyway, because the alternative, turning off the screen, sitting in darkness, confronting our actual solitude, is too frightening. So we scroll, and Mark builds, and the blue glow continues. And we tell ourselves this is connection. And sometimes late at night, when the feed runs dry and the notifications stop, and we're left with just ourselves and the screen, we wonder if maybe the lonely programmer was trying to solve an unsolvable problem. And if maybe, just maybe, we should stop asking him to solve it for us, and solve it ourselves. By closing the laptop, by turning off the phone, by being here, now, present, with whoever is in the room, or brave enough to be alone, really alone, without the blue glow to keep us company, without the illusion that somewhere, out there, in the feed, in the metaverse, in the endless connection, we'll finally find what we're looking for. We won't. It was never there. It's here. It always was. We just had to look away from the screen to see it.